Hey guys. You are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part, what if Deku had a healing quirk fueled by pain. Here is short summary. Izuku manifests a incredibly strong healing quirk named Sympatheic healing. A quirk that allows him to heal people as long as he himself is in some sort of pain. Izuku is excited as it will be an amazing hero with this quirk. Inko is terrified. Years down the line, Hawks is taken to a hidden HPSC facility after being injured and meets a fluffy green bean of a child. Hawks won't let another child be under the HPSC's thumb and vows to get him out of there, even though he feels way out of his depth the whole time. Aizawa is roped into a dangerous rescue mission. On paper it is for one child, but he knows that this is actually a rescue of one child and one young hero. His protective instincts might seem excessive to some, but he thinks it's only logical. His fiance thinks it's cute. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Izuku woke up with a sigh. He slithered an arm out from under the blankets to tap his alarm clock. Big days were rough, and they kept getting rougher every time. Sitting up with a big stretch, Izuku forced a smile on his face. Maybe today they would let him actually meet All Might. Ms. Komori got him a signature from the hero right before she was switched for Mr. Watanabe. Izuku couldn't help but miss Ms. Komori. She was a good guardian. She made sure that Izuku got not only what he needed but some fun things too. Not like Izuku wasn't grateful for having Mr. Watanabe as his guardian. Don't get the wrong idea. Izuku was very grateful that Mr. Watanabe made sure Izuku was fed and healthy, but the man was just so intense. The few times that Izuku had asked for anything beyond the absolute bare necessities, he just blankly looked down at Izuku. It kind of freaked Izuku out enough to just stop asking. It just made the various hero action figures and drawing supplies all that more special. The collection of hero merch was nowhere near what he'd had growing up, but knowing half of the All Might figures came from the man himself, it made them priceless. Izuku threw off his covers and shivered. It was always just a little colder than Izuku preferred it, but it gave him an excuse to wear the fat gum hoodie that Ms. Komori had gotten him. Don't tell anyone, but it was better than his All Might one. He knows, a huge fanboy like him shouldn't hate, but it was softer and oversized in the best ways that the All Might one just wasn't. It also wasn't blood-stained yet, but that isn't really the sweatshirt's fault. Thinking about blood, Izuku twisted his arms around to check the bandages. They were pristine white. Score! The cuts on his forearms hadn't reopened overnight. He could wear the bright yellow hoodie without too much concern then. With a bright smile he jumped off his bed and collapsed to the floor with a surprised grunt. On the floor Izuku let out a world-weary sigh. He'd forgotten about his leg. Again. Izuku knew something was wrong with it. Ever since that first day here, a knobby bump stuck out from his shin. It had taken almost 3 months before he could really walk on it. And even a year later, if he stepped wrong, it'd just crumple under him like a sheet of paper in a disgruntled artist's hands. Izuku crawled to the edge of his bed and hoisted himself up with his good leg and arm. Trying again, he took a tentative step, and then another, and another. His leg seemed okay now, beyond the normal zings of pain that radiated from his knee, ankle and hip. That just was how it was now. As long as he could walk it was fine. Izuku let himself smile as he limped the last meter or so to his bookshelf. Excitedly, he pulled the rumpled hoodie off the shelf and slipped it over his head. He traced the simple little boxy pattern on the front replicating Fat Gum's hero suit. Curling his hands into sweater paws, Izuku limped across the room to his desk. He pulled out the office chair and collapsed into it with a huff. Opening his bottom drawer in his desk, he grabbed his school books. It'd be a few hours before Mr. Watanabe came to unlock his door so he could go brush his teeth and shower. If Izuku really needed the bathroom before his door was unlocked, he'd learned how to navigate the vents, so it really wasn't that big of an issue anymore. Izuku started towards the piles of books before pausing. Instead, he pulled out his vent diagram and ruler with a smile. He ran his fingers over it. He was proud of his work, but no matter how much he wanted to work on his fun project, school came first. It wasn't hard, but Izuku couldn't bring the pencil to paper to write down the answer. His mom had always loved math, and Izuku loved asking for help with it. Not because he didn't understand, though sometimes it was because he didn't understand, but it was more from just how excited Mom got. Her eyes sparkled, and her grin was open and easy every time. No matter how tired she looked, it would perk her up. She also got so silly with the explanations. Drawing little elephant friends who needed help dividing their peanuts. Or little stick figures who were shopping for strawberries. One summer she'd even forced him to calculate hero ranking statistics because he'd struggled with long division and long multiplication. Statistics were kind of hard, but he'd figured it out. Izuku had had a weird mix of excitement and annoyance while doing it. But Mako and Mom had helped him get through the top 100 in no time at all. Looking down at the page of fractions in the book, Izuku sniffed. His eyes filled with tears. He didn't really want to do his math homework anymore. The equations smeared and warped as the tears bubbled out of his eyes. Izuku closed his eyes and gnawed on his lower lip. He listened to the soft pat-pat-pat of the tears hitting the textbook pages. After a few minutes he took a deep breath and wiped his face. It wasn't like he could actually skip his schoolwork. Not only would that be wasting the time of the nice tutors and Mr. Watanabe expected him to do well in his studies, but Mom always told Izuku that school was cool. And that he was her cute little nerd when he'd agree wholeheartedly. She'd always wanted him to do his best at school, even if his best varied by subject or unit. She told him again and again that what really mattered was if he gave it his all. And he was going to give it his all. Izuku swallowed around the rock lodged in his throat as he looked back down at the first equation. 1/6 plus 4/6 equals? Grabbing his pencil, Izuku nodded to himself, determined to make his mom proud. He wrote a confident 5/6. Izuku continued down the page with a wide smile, imagining Mom sitting next to him, clapping and cheering him on with each answer. In no time at all, Izuku had finished all his math and moved on to his other subjects. Literature was a bit challenging as it was a poetry unit. His homework was writing poems in different meters. He struggled to come up with topics, but ended up writing about two of his favorite heroes, All Might and Hawks. Hawks Kago was so cool. He wasn't All Might cool, but he was cool nonetheless. Izuku had never had the chance to see Hawks up close before last week, but he had seen him on TV before. He'd seemed really cool on TV, but Kago was about 10 billion times cooler in person. Most adults just zoned out when Izuku would go on excited rants about heroes, except his mom, or if she did she'd apologize and ask him to repeat himself. His peers bullied him for it, calling him a freaky fanboy. Even Kachan, one of Izuku's closest friends, yelled at him about it. But Kago listened so closely even with how long and complex tapping back and forth through the feathers was. He spent hours just listening to Izuku, and every time he worried that Kago had maybe stopped listening, the hero would ask a question or interject a thought about whatever he'd been talking about. It made Izuku feel warm all over, even in the chill of his room. Beyond Mako and Kachan, Izuku had never really had many friends, and Kago kind of felt like the cool older brother he'd always wanted. Not like Izuku knew what having an older sibling was actually like, but he was pretty sure it was similar. He trusted Kago, and Izuku had to constantly stop himself from telling Kago the things that Mr. Watanabe had told him were off limits to talk about. It was all for his safety. The villains were still at large, but it had been a year with few leads who had killed his. Well, let's just say it had been forever, and Izuku was getting impatient. And it felt silly keeping things so secret when it wasn't like Izuku ever got to leave the facility. And if anyone was trustworthy with a secret like this, it would be a hero like Hawks. So of course he ended up caving and giving Kago his name. It was Kago, a hero who was known for being secretive, who gave Izuku his given name without second thought. He knew how high of an honor it was to know something so personal. Honestly, Izuku had decided to tell Kago everything. It had been a long time since he'd had someone like Ms. Komori, someone he could just talk to and know they would listen. Having another person like that was really, really nice. And Hawks had amazing hero statistics. He would know, he'd calculated them, and he'd understand why Izuku needed protection and maybe would take the case on himself. Make some headway, maybe even find the villains and capture them. If that happened, maybe Izuku would be allowed outside again. Izuku had never really been a super outdoorsy person, but he missed it. Just the thought of seeing the sunrise had him vibrating in his seat in excitement. His mom had promised to get him a telescope for his birthday, which didn't happen obviously. He might not have one, but maybe Keigo had one? Keigo seemed to like wide open spaces. Better for flying. Maybe he liked stargazing. Izuku would have to ask this evening. The last time he had been allowed outside was the day before Ms. Komori got transferred. Izuku couldn't help but feel that his incessant asking to go outside and her caving was the thing that got her transferred. She'd told him it wasn't his fault at all, and this was actually a good thing as she was promoted partially from how much of a hard worker he was. Izuku wasn't really sure how much he believed her though. Something about the way she'd given him their first and only hug. How it was overly tight. She'd also leaned in and whispered in his ear. "Don't let them take your spark, Izu-kun." At the time he just nodded over what she'd meant, but after some thought he decided to put it along with his mom's desire for him to do his best and to stay kind. And Izuku could do that. What Izuku wasn't sure he could do was wait any longer to go to the bathroom. Izuku set his now completed homework in his drawer while he squirmed in his seat. His clock said 8:45 a.m. Mr. Watanabe said that punctuality was of highest importance for an agent, or in Izuku's case, future hero. But the man was doing the "practice what I preach and not what I do" thing that adults do. If Izuku knew that the man would be there at 9 on the dot like he said he would, Izuku could probably wait. But if it was like the one day that Mr. Watanabe hadn't shown up at all and only sent some other agent to let him out around 11, he would not make it. It was shortly after that day that Izuku started his escapades into the vents. Izuku wasn't going to be caught peeing his pants ever again. Izuku had just started actually mapping out the vents in the past few weeks. He kinda hoped that he might figure out a way to get outside for some fresh air. Standing, Izuku slid his desk chair to the wall next to his desk. Ever so carefully, he clambered up onto the seat. He made sure not to let the chair shift or swivel. He'd fallen off before and it had hurt. Izuku finally understood why Mom had told him time and time again to not stand on their wheeled computer chair. It was as dangerous as his mom had said. Once he was fully upright, Izuku was able to step up onto his desk. He leaned heavily onto the wall for balance. In the wall above his desk was a large vent cover. A vent cover on which Izuku had ruined the stiff plastic of an all-might action figure hand to unscrew the corner screws. A different day he'd been able to pocket one of the knives and used it to carve the thin aluminum screw holes to be bigger. Instead of holding the plate close to the wall, the vent cover now just rested on the screws, like a painting hanging on the wall. It made it much easier to just reach up and take the cover off the wall. It had been totally worth the days it had taken to scrape the metal down. Gripping the edge of the vent, Izuku flexed his arms and hauled himself up and into the vent. Izuku grinned. When he just started exploring the vents it had been really hard to get into them. But now, months later, the muscles in Izuku's arms were super strong. He was kind of glad as it would definitely make him a better hero. He would be great at helping move rubble or fight villains. It might even help him get into UA. If he was allowed to go to actual school by then. Izuku sighed as he took the 2 lefts followed by a right to get to the nearest bathroom in no time at all. He'd gotten really good at crawling in the confined space with only 3 limbs. Izuku slid his fingers into the grate and popped off the bathroom's ceiling vent. It was a little tricky, but by this point Izuku was proud to say he was practically a pro. Izuku took a steadying breath before dropping just his legs down the hole and let them dangle. His arms holding him up started to shake just a little as he started to swing a little. He searched with his toes of his good foot for the top edge of the bathroom stall wall. After a few tries he found it and gripped as well as he could with his toes. Next was that hardest part. Izuku took a deep breath and pushed off while ducking his head to his chest to feel the edge of the vent brush his wild green curls, just missing his head by centimeters. It took a lot of tries to figure out how to do this without whacking his head, but he had persevered. It had been really hard to explain the additional cuts and bruises to Mr. Watanabe. Now, he had it down to a science and was able to duck in such a way to keep the momentum to arch his body up and towards the corner post of the bathroom stall to grab it with his hands. After his hands slapped the post, Izuku grinned. He always felt a little like a cat as he walked across the top edge of the stalls using the ball of his good foot and his palms. His bad foot was used more just for balance, as it did not like being weight-bearing in this awkward position. Finally he reached the larger handicapped stall. Izuku swung his legs over the side to rest his good foot on the bar attached to the wall. Then he lowered himself to the floor. It felt so nice to finally do his business, wash his hands and even splash some cool water on his face. In the past he had used some paper towels to scrape off some of the plaque, but today he was on a time crunch. Mr. Watanabe was more likely to be close to on time on a big day. Izuku would be brushing his teeth soon anyway, so it was a waste of time. Instead, Izuku just cupped his hands and took a quick sip of the cool water, swishing and spitting once or twice to try to rinse off some of the scuzz. Izuku looked in the mirror and grinned. He was proud of how good he'd gotten at taking care of himself. It had been hard to figure out at the beginning, but he had a rhythm now. He looked around, wishing not for the first time that someone would install a clock in this bathroom. Sure, it would be weird, but it would make Izuku's life so much easier. He was pretty sure he had maybe 5 minutes to get back. He looked at his reflection directly in its green eyes. Giving himself a determined nod and huge grin, he whispered to himself, "I bet we can do it in 3. With no way of knowing for sure it was 3 minutes, Izuku checked how long he was gone in full. He was proud to admit that the whole round trip had only taken just under 12 minutes, which was a new world record. Izuku settled back at his desk, working on mapping out the vents, or more like doodling as he waited. Little cartoon hawks taking fun fighting poses around the edges mixed in with the little fat gums, Marikos, present mics, and of course many all mites. He slid off his chair the moment Mr. Watanabe had come in at 9:08. Izuku wanted to show off the little doodles, they were really good. But with them being on his vent diagram he kept quiet. Something told him that Mr. Watanabe would not be impressed with his vent adventures. He might even make it really hard for him to continue. Izuku was having too much fun plotting out the vents to risk it. Also, if he started talking about the vents, he'd for sure mention Keigo and the feather that was tucked between his mattress. And he knew that Mr. Watanabe would be angry that he'd been talking to the hero. So, no talking about anything that might lead to loss of vent privileges. Mom had explained the saying, "It is better to ask for forgiveness instead of permission," after it was used in an All Might movie. She'd told him that with her he could always ask permission and that it was best to ask permission for his safety and well-being. She'd also promised to listen to his ideas if he promised to do the same with her points in response. It had worked great at home, but here? Izuku had learned that it might actually be better to just not say anything. Then, he didn't have to get permission or forgiveness. It had worked for him this far, and Izuku wasn't going to change now. A loud snap of fingers from the now distant Mr. Watanabe made Izuku jump to attention. Izuku's eyes widened at just how far behind he'd gotten. He knew he might have pushed himself too much this morning between waking up super early to get all his class work for the next 2 days done and making a new world record-breaking bathroom speedrun. His leg ached something fierce and he was tired. The snapping grew more impatient. Izuku bit his lip as he sped up from his less painful slow limp to an awkward shuffling jog. Each time his bad leg hit the ground, hot flashes of pain bounced from his ankle up to his knee. Tears pricked at the back of his eyes. He caught up to Mr. Watanabe, who rested a firm hand to Izuku's back. He pushed him forward into the bathroom suite. Izuku made sure to be slow so the man would have to push a little harder. Even though he knew that it was just to make sure Izuku didn't dawdle, he couldn't help but use his imagination with the pressure. The firm hand melted and morphed into the comforting tight hold of one of Mom's hugs. It was nice. He liked to think that it was so easy to imagine it because Mom's spirit was with him. He also was pretty sure his mom had sent Hawks to be his friend, and maybe big brother. That made Izuku smile. "Clean yourself. I will be outside to bring you to the cafeteria." Mr. Watanabe's stern tenor voice was filled with authority. Izuku dropped his smile. "Yes, sir." Izuku gave him a small bow before clumsily twisting into the bathroom. Mr. Watanabe closed the door behind him. This bathroom was different than the one he'd used this morning. This one was nicer, set up more like a bathroom in an apartment. The other one was more like the kind of run-down bathrooms found in some public beach parks. All old tiles that are a little stained, with stainless steel toilets and sinks. But this one was full of warm orangey-brown tiles and a roomy tub shower tucked in the corner and an actual white porcelain toilet. Izuku was pretty sure that he was the only person who used this bathroom. The fluffy hero-themed towels never moved unless he used them. He grabbed his toothbrush out of the mug that was shaped like All Might's head. The little hair tufts made it impossible to drink out of without poking out an eye. Izuku knew as he'd tried to find a way. He hadn't been successful, but he'd found a good use for it, bizarre design and all. Izuku was quick in brushing his teeth and taking a shower. He tried to go to the bathroom again, but it really hadn't been that long since he went. It was always better to take the opportunity though, never knew when the next one would arise. Izuku really wanted to dawdle, but not only had Mom told him there was a time and place for dawdling, but Mr. Watanabe always got frustrated if he took too long. And it kind of felt like any amount of time was too long for the man, but Izuku kept trying to shorten his showers while still getting clean. And he wanted Mr. Watanabe to be happy because maybe today was the day he was able to convince the man to let him actually meet All Might. To do that he would have to be perfect and fast. Izuku slid out of the now steamy bathroom in probably 6 or 7 minutes, 8 tops. Mr. Watanabe stood from the uncomfortable-looking chair that was pressed against the wall across from the bathroom. His red eyes traced up and down Izuku's body. Izuku couldn't help but shuffle a little before looking down at himself. Izuku could feel how wet his hair still was, watching as water drops plopped onto his simple black t-shirt. His fresh bandages on his arms were sloppy, but at this point they were more a way to keep him from picking at the long, thin scabs. The loose, scrub-like, dark blue pants were just a little too long and dragged on the ground under his heels. He was wearing a pair of silly present Mike socks. The long yellow tubes of his hair and triangle shades were hidden under his pants, only to have the sock depiction of the hero look like he was wearing a dark blue bandana. Izuku wiggled his toes. A smile cracked across his face as the wide grin of the 2 sock present Mikes stretched in silly ways. "You look acceptable. Follow quickly." Izuku nodded and tried to focus better on keeping pace with the long strides of the tall man. Rounding the corner of the hallway, Izuku looked up at the stony expression chiseled into the man's rectangular face. Izuku curled his fingers into tight fists and took a deep breath. The worst that he could say was no, Izuku reminded himself. He was still nervous, but tried to fill himself with confidence and determination as he opened his mouth. Sir?" Izuku cringed. His voice came out more of a squeak, not the confident tone he'd aimed for. He swallowed, cleared his throat and tried again. "Mr. Watanabe." The man slowed, but didn't stop. His red gaze shifted to Izuku. Something about it made him feel a twist of nerves. Izuku flicked his eyes away, looking at some weird fern pushed against the wall. He crossed an arm over his chest and picked at the already fraying edge of his bandages. I was wondering if spit it out, boy." Izuku flinched out a nod before taking a deep breath. "It's been a long time that I have been healing All Might now. And I only got to see him that one time and he was unconscious and looked awful." Izuku couldn't seem to stop the word vomit from tumbling out of his mouth. Instead of stopping, his shoulders just raised like they were being slowly cranked towards his ears. I was hoping that I could actually see some of the progress. He is really, really cool and my favorite hero, and I want to make sure he is actually okay. Not like I don't believe you, but I'd like to see it with my own eyes. And I was hoping to maybe get to talk to him." Izuku stopped and looked down at his feet as he wiggled his toes in the silly socks. He bit his lip before continuing a little softer. "I want to tell him I'm a big fan and I'm glad he's okay." At this, Mr. Watanabe finally paused in the middle of the hall and turned to Izuku. Izuku couldn't bring himself to raise his eyes, a little worried what he would find in Mr. Watanabe's face and hard red eyes. After just enough time for Izuku to seriously regret his life choices and start to mentally beg the floor to open up and swallow him whole, Mr. Watanabe responded. "No." With that simple response, the man started back down the hall. Izuku slumped his shoulders with a heavy sigh. He gave his toes one final wiggle. It kind of looked like the socks were laughing at him. If Izuku was honest with himself, he knew the answer would be no. Izuku wanted to maybe ask again, but he knew that Mr. Watanabe didn't like repeating himself, so his word was final. It wasn't fair though. Izuku had been healing All Might at least once, sometimes twice, a month for most of a year. And for Izuku's safety he couldn't even see the hero. His favorite hero? Who was Izuku more safe with than the #1 hero himself? Izuku would never say it out loud, but he highly doubted that Mr. Watanabe would win if the villains who were after him attacked the facility. All Might, though, undoubtedly he would win. Even with his new injuries, there was no way any commission agent was more capable than All Might. So it just didn't make any sense. But Izuku had known for a long time that adults didn't make any sense. A few impatient snaps forced Izuku to stumble into a painful jog once more. Izuku was hungry and didn't want Mr. Watanabe to tell Chef Jessica to give him cold porridge again. After a filling breakfast of eggs, rice, and miso soup from Chef Jessica, Izuku started the process of preparing for his big appointment. Izuku thought it was ridiculous how long it took every time. He'd rather just get everything over with quickly instead of dragging it all out. But the doctors had told him again and again that every step was important and was for his own good. It started with a simple health checkup. The doctors and nurses checked his blood pressure, his height and weight, iron and blood sugar levels, and a bunch of other little tests that Izuku had asked in the past but couldn't really remember what they were for. The doctors were usually better than Mr. Watanabe about questions, but Izuku didn't want to push it. After the medical checkup, Izuku would be taken back to his room for a while the doctors worked together to tailor the procedures to his health levels that day to make sure it was never too much for him to handle. It was nice to know he had a whole team of people making sure he was going to be okay. It always settled the buzzing anxiety that filled him on these big days. They all wanted the best for him now. Make sure he is comfortable through the whole process. They would make sure to explain every step of every single procedure. They also listened when he was unsure about the order or specific steps. They were always calm and would explain why things were the way they were, and when they would switch things around. It kind of reminded Izuku of his and his mom's conversations about serious matters. It was really nice. Of course, in emergencies, the medical team couldn't go through all of this, but with their help he'd made a list of what he was okay with in a pinch. He preferred things that he could do to himself if he was going to be honest. Not like he didn't trust the agents that helped him, but having the knife in his own hand was less scary than it being in someone else's. Unfortunately, All Might's condition kept the hero needing consistent, hefty healing sessions. Ones that Izuku couldn't begin to do to himself. Izuku's vision was replaced with that of a year ago. His favorite hero laid out on the hospital bed. Blood was everywhere, the smell filling Izuku's nose. Nurses and doctors were running around, using their red slicked gloved hands to hold squishy-looking things into the gaping hole in the hero's side. So many tubes and wires were attached and shoved into him. The agent's tight grip on his arms as he thrashed around, hot tears carving harsh tracks down his face. The loud shouts and medical equipment screaming as All Might flat-lined. The vision of All Might shifted to the last expression of his mom. Her green eyes wide with worry, blood streaking down her face, her arms outstretched grasping at the air as Izuku drifted further and further. The piercing scream of unadulterated parental rage as Izuku finally turned the corner out of her vision. The scream cut off abruptly. The silence rang in his ears the way the scream never could. Izuku blinked. Back in his room. He hated going on those little trips. He always felt a little funny afterward but just let himself sink into the oversized sweater he had put back on. The soft fabric made him feel a little better, so he tightened his grip on his pencil to work on his Venn diagram. All Might was fine now. He had survived. Izuku had done that and was proud. It was Izuku's continual efforts that was keeping the #1 hero able to continue to keep the streets safe. Izuku had been told that time and time again. So it was all worth it. The plan up for this session had been a bit scary. More than usual. But Izuku wanted to be a hero, and sometimes heroes had to do things that were scary. Izuku had given the doctors a shaky smile before signing the digital forms. He agreed to it, so now all he needed to do was follow through. Even though he kinda regretted okaying it now. But he could do it, for All Might. A blossom of pride bloomed in his chest when the doctor had called him brave. The taste of the little hard candy was still on his tongue, even though the candy was long gone. The knock on his door made Izuku jump. He started to twist his fingers, wringing his hands. It was time. Mr. Watanabe opened the door and gestured for Izuku into the healing room that was attached to his bedroom. The room was a bit scary. The large metal tub table bed thing with straps was hard to look at, and the stinging of disinfectant made his eyes water. Izuku was glad his room had 2 doors and he only used this one when he was having to heal someone. He was glad he could sometimes go weeks ignoring that this room existed. He even avoided the vent paths that crossed over this room just so he didn't have to think about it, even though it was a more direct path to the bathroom. He just didn't want to. Izuku felt himself start to tense as he took more slow steps into the room. He rolled his shoulders before berating himself. It has to hurt to heal, he knew that, so this room and everything that happens here were a necessary evil. If heroes like All Might or Hawks were not able to patrol, the villains would go crazy. Izuku needed to do this. It kept people safe. No matter how many times he reasoned with himself, Izuku felt his heart race and sweat pool on his skin. He wiped his now sweaty, trembling hands on the sides of his pants. He hated this room. He preferred it when he was allowed in the other room, doing his own procedures. That usually only happened in emergencies where the patient was unconscious. Well, until Hawks, he'd been sort of awake. But Izuku was pretty sure that had been a mistake because afterwards the doctors had told him again and again that it was okay as Hawks didn't remember him, so he was safe. Which, of course, he was safe. It was Keigo. Adults made no sense most of the time, but he just nodded and let them say what they were going to say. Izuku didn't want to wish an emergency on his favorite hero, and was very glad All Might was conscious and doing well. But a part of him really wished he didn't have to be in this room. Mr. Watanabe grabbed Izuku's wrist and yanked him to the center of the room, obviously annoyed it was taking him so long. The tight grip kind of hurt his scabbed wrists and the stumble had jarred his bad leg, but he made sure not to make any noise. After the man let go, Izuku tried to subtly massage the arm as he stood on one foot. He watched as Mr. Courage and Ms. Itadori walked into the room from the other, warmer, medical room. A large hand pushed Izuku towards the two from behind, making him stumble forward. Without thinking, Izuku tried to catch himself with his bad leg. Before he could hit the floor, he felt the long thin hands of Mr. Courage catch his elbows and push him back upright. Izuku knew the man's quirk was inactive. The mushroom-like dome of purple hair was not glowing, but he still flinched at the cool fingers for some reason. Almost like he was expecting it to hurt, but they hadn't started yet, so that was ridiculous. Easy there, kid. Mr. Courage let go of Izuku's elbows with his dark hands. He took a step back. Izuku finally felt like he could breathe. Change into this. We don't want your nice clothes ruined. Izuku's view of the thin dark hands was obscured by Ms. Itadori's tanned olive-tone hands wrapped around a bundled-up hospital gown. Izuku had mechanically grabbed it from her and started to strip down. In the past he had gone back to his room to change. The last few times the mix of his aching leg and the exhausting nerves made him too slow for Mr. Watanabe's liking. To avoid the man's ire, Izuku stopped seeking out privacy. Now stripped to his All Might boxers, Izuku slipped on the crinkly gown. He hated the feel of the fabric of these gowns. But it was the thing that kept him from staining any more of his clothes. And while Fat Gum and Present Mike were not in his top 10 favorite heroes, he didn't want his precious merch ruined. Even in the name of healing All Might. Ms. Itadori stiffly took the clothes from Izuku and disappeared into his room. He was jealous. He wanted to go back to his room. A loud scraping noise made Izuku jump. Spinning around, he just saw Mr. Courage pushing the metal footstool over with his foot. The incredibly thin man patted the metal tub table bed thing. Each of the echoey booms flipped and flopped Izuku's heart in his chest. Izuku tried not to dawdle, but he found himself jumping at the sharp snapping of Mr. Watanabe. Izuku scuttled up and onto the table as fast as he could. By that point, the short, plain-looking Ms. Itadori was back, the purple silicone-wrapped stick for his mouth in her hand. Izuku swallowed his spit before he let his mouth creak open. Sometimes the stick would have nice flavors rubbed on soft silicone. This time it just had the sharp tang of disinfectant. Except for the taste, it was honestly nice to gnaw on. He focused on the feeling of it squishing around his teeth as he pointedly ignored the clicks of the strap being latched behind his head. The first few times he'd agreed to any procedures he'd gotten overwhelmed and ended up screaming and biting his own tongue. After that, one of the doctors had brought him the biting stick. He still could bite the sides of his mouth or tongue if he tried, but usually once the procedure started he just clenched his jaw as hard as he could, so it was rarely a concern. Ms. Itadori gently pushed Izuku's head down onto the hard foam pad, forcing him to lean onto the table. It was cold under his bare arms and legs. The cool metal slowly edged the heat through the thin material of the gown, making Izuku shiver. Both Mr. Courage and Ms. Itadori worked efficiently together to buckle the soft wrist, ankle and waist straps that held Izuku to the table. Izuku during this counted the ceiling tiles. He already knew the number was 184, but he counted them again anyway. The walkie-talkie on Mr. Watanabe's hip chirped. Izuku's chest ached. The crackling voice over the radio broke Izuku's count at 62. All Might is in position. You may start the procedure. Understood. Mr. Watanabe clipped the radio back to his belt and turned to Izuku. A little spray can was in his hand. Are you ready to begin? Remember? The other two adults joined in. It has to hurt to heal. Izuku nodded and gave the "okay" sign with his left hand. Mr. Watanabe's lips twisted and curled into what Izuku thought was a smile. It had taken him a few months to recognize it as such, and he tried hard not to judge a person based on appearance, just like Mom had taught him. But it was all teeth and sharp in a way that made Izuku's skin crawl. Izuku broke eye contact and held his breath, not able to keep looking at the excited man. Thank you for your sacrifice, Izuku. I am so proud of you. From the corner of Izuku's eye he saw how the can was raised up to his eyes. He didn't see Mr. Watanabe's finger move to the trigger, but it must have happened. The familiar burning of the pepper spray filled Izuku's eyes. He squirmed as he shut his eyes tight. It was unpleasant, but at this point, not really that bad. The worst part was the anxiety from not being able to see. Months ago he had asked the doctors if he could have the pepper spray be after the other more scary procedures. But after a long discussion it had been decided that him flinching preemptively was negatively impacting the effectiveness of the treatments. Izuku hated the pepper spray, but the soft blindfold was worse. At least with the burning pain in his eyes, not being able to see was his choice. Izuku listened to the soft shuffling and even breaths in the quiet room. He mentally mapped out who was where. The doctors told him to try not to brace at all for the pain, to just let it happen, but Izuku just couldn't help it. Sneaking a peek, Izuku opened his watery eyes just a sliver. Tears were thick in his eyelashes, making his vision basically useless. But after a moment, through the wavering shimmering vision Izuku spotted the soft purple glow smearing across his vision. Izuku bit down tight on the stick and squeezed his eyes shut. The cool caress of Mr. Courage's fingers almost tickled before the looping trails erupted into sharp prickles of pain. Izuku felt his arm muscles flex and relax in quick succession as the man's thin fingers continued to trace along Izuku's clammy skin. Izuku had never been stung by a normal jellyfish and wondered how it compared to Mr. Courage's Quirk. The painful and soft touches paused. The footsteps made Izuku assume that Mr. Courage was shifting to his other arm. The stung arm trembled, feeling a strange mix of numb and searing, itchy pain. The reprieve from the pain was only a few short breaths before the soft loopy touch swooped up and down his other arm. Izuku started to count his breaths. Ms. Komori had taught him how counting breaths can help a person keep calm and give them something to focus on. Izuku found it helped, but that counting to 4 over and over was boring, so he'd turned it into a little game. He would start with breathing in for a count of 2, then out for 2, then he'd add 1 to the number to see how high of a number he could get. His record was around 22 or 23. At that point it kind of got hard to any more air into his lungs, or his vision would start to fuzz with black dots. Izuku was sure that he could get to a higher number if he counted faster, but that felt like cheating. Izuku had gotten up to a count of 12 when what sounded like sand poured onto the table. Izuku knew to expect the skittering tinny sound at some point, but it still made him jolt a bit against the straps. Slowly the eerie ticklish sensation of hundreds of tiny insect feet flooded over his feet. It took everything in Izuku to keep still through the sensation. He wanted to rub his feet together or roll his ankles against the cold metal below him. But he didn't want to kill the ants. It wasn't their fault that they were tickling his toes. They were just following Ms. Itadori's instructions. These were a new species. Bullet ants, the doctors had said. The pain would be more than the bites he was used to, but was needed to make sure All Might stayed at his best. The bites started, and it felt like long red-hot nails were being pounded into his feet. Izuku sent a small mental apology to the ants he squished as he rolled his feet. He didn't want to, but the bites were excruciating. They said it would be a little worse than the fire ants, but this had to be about 1,000,000 times worse, if not a bazillion. Izuku shifted and squirmed, tugging against the straps. It hurt. It hurt so much worse than he'd thought it would. A pained hiss leaped out of his mouth, followed by wet, ragged gasps. With another wave of bites, Izuku arched his back. He bit down on the bar, only for his mouth to fill with the metallic tang of blood. The bite bar had slipped a little. Izuku twisted his head to let the blood and spit dribble out of the corner of his mouth. Izuku was a little out of it, and his mental map had gotten really fuzzy, so he wasn't sure anymore who it was, but someone tightened the bar strap fairly aggressively. He let out a small whimper as they ripped out a small section of his hair. "Be quiet." Mr. Watanabe's voice filled Izuku's ears and shot ice into his veins. The man's sour breath blew along his ear and wet cheek. Izuku pulled a little at the bindings, trying to shift away. "We can't have All Might hearing you. It'd be dangerous. The villains, remember?" Izuku bit back a sob as the waves of stings, burns, and stabs radiated throughout his body. Tears cascaded down his face faster as he nodded like a bobblehead. He could be quiet. Of course he could. He had to be quiet. But it was so hard. Izuku had never realized how much pain that his small body could produce. It felt like every single one of his nerves were active and screaming. He wished he could join in their silent symphony. Instead, he bit down, feeling his jaw and teeth creak and groan at the pressure. The throbbing low beat of ache from his jaw and stretched lips created a bass beat to support the mid-tone stings with their looping arpeggios written up and down his arms. And then over it all was the warbling, screeching melody of the nail-like ant bites, digging deeper and deeper into his inflamed feet and ankles. It all was unrelenting and jarring. Nausea rolled in his stomach like a timpani. Izuku swallowed back the bile. He did not want to choke on his vomit. The acid always made him feel like he was drowning, and the cough lasted weeks before it cleared up. He tried to play in and out again, but he kept losing count and couldn't get past 4 or 5. There was another wave of pain, and Izuku felt his body roll and arch off the table again before slumping to the table with a soft thump. The burning in his eyes was clearing with each tear that fell down his face and onto the hard foam cushion below his head. The tears mixed into a nasty slurry with a little bit of blood, spit and sweat on the plastic fabric cover. It grossly stuck to his cheeks as he rolled his head from side to side. He hated this. He hated this so much. There was no way of knowing how much longer was left. It was getting harder and harder to keep from making any noises. He really wanted to scream. There was a beep. The walkie-talkie. Relief flooded through him. Oh good, that meant that Izuku was close to being done. Izuku furrowed his brow. They weren't stopping. The radio going off meant they were done. Why were they not stopping? There were words, but Izuku struggled to understand the staticky voice of the radio. A firm hand pressed into his chest. It made it a little hard to breathe. Izuku opened his eyes and saw the much too close, blurry face of Mr. Watanabe. The view faded as Izuku's eyelids flickered closed again. He was tired and cold, and everything hurt. The hand pushed harder on his ribs, pushing out a grunt from Izuku. He opened his eyes when a different hand slapped his cheeks. There were a few barked-out words Izuku didn't catch. All the new pain stopped, only the throbbing echoes making him shiver. He was able to focus up on the face above him a little better. "Izuku. We need more. All Might isn't healing fast enough. Do you consent?" Izuku almost gave himself whiplash as he tossed his head from side to side. No, this is not what he'd agreed to. They'd promised to never switch it up once the plan was in place. He could handle it if he agreed to it before, but he didn't like it when plans were switched up at the last minute like this. He couldn't do more. He couldn't. This was too much already, and they wanted more? Izuku's stomach twisted and his heart pounded. He felt dizzy. It was too hot and too cold. All his limbs were heavy and trembling uncontrollably. His eyes burned and prickled from the constant tears and pepper spray. The stretched skin around his lips and clenched jaw ached. Even the little patch of skin at the back of his head throbbed where the hair had been torn. How was this not enough? They wanted too much. He just wanted his mom. Izuku slumped back into the table. That wasn't an option anymore, though. She had died a hero trying to save him. His eyes drifted to the expectant expression on Mr. Watanabe's face. Izuku wanted to be a hero. Like Keigo. Like All Might. Like Mom. He nodded slowly. Izuku felt lighter than the red feather hidden in his room. He was made of mist. If someone blew too hard he'd just dissipate into the air. That kind of sounded nice if Izuku was going to be honest. Mr. Watanabe was no longer in Izuku's view. He wanted to ask what he'd just agreed to but he couldn't. The sound of spray and the spicy smell filled Izuku's hearing and nose. He barely felt the sting as he screwed his eyes shut. More nails were pounded into his feet and ankles. More looping stings were added to his arms. Izuku's mist body was slammed back into his normal body. It felt like he'd been thrown through a brick wall of pain, and he sputtered out a small gasp. Any focus that Izuku had gained disappeared into the waves of nausea and pain. The sound of the knives being pulled out of the knife block rang out just overhead. Oh, cutting. He slumped against the table. Cutting Izuku could handle. The sharp staccato of quick criss-crossing cuts sliced across his thighs, settling perfectly into the rest of Izuku's symphony of pain. Izuku felt himself float away again. The pain was both there and also not. His body trembled but he was just an observer now. Distant, removed. Izuku liked this. It was a lot easier this way, even if it was a little weird. It almost felt like when he did those meditations with Ms. Komori. He was vaguely aware of the wet feeling sliding over his thighs and dripping down the sides of his legs, pooling under him. It made the normally cold table feel warm and sticky. He didn't like it. The addition of new pains paused. Maybe he was done? Izuku screwed his face up, confused. He hadn't heard the radio beep. Maybe he'd missed it, wouldn't be the first time that happened. He blinked open his eyes just in time to see Mr. Courage upend a large glass jug over his lap. Izuku's vision whited out as the liquid sloshed over the flayed skin. It burned. It felt like his skin was disintegrating. Izuku let out a warbling scream. A large hand slapped his face, covering his mouth and nose. It dug the bar deeper into his cheeks and mouth, hitting far enough back that he gagged. It mixed with the smell of blood, sweat, and pepper spray. He gagged again, and this time bile filled his mouth. The hand over his mouth forced him to hold the disgusting acid in his mouth in fear of breathing it in. It was hard to breathe. Izuku scrambled, scratching uselessly at the smooth metal. He thrashed his head back and forth trying to shake the hand off his face. He kicked his legs. Thumping loudly against the table he let out a pain at the horrible pain that cascaded through his body. Like a series of bombs exploding. He shifted and squirmed and screamed from under the hand. More hands joined in the efforts to hold him down. He bucked and fought back as much as he could. But he was tied down, dizzy, and felt really awful. A whisper pierced through his panic making him freeze. All Might heard, "You brat. Stop it now or I'll slice your throat open." The razor-sharp feeling of a knife pressed against his throat. They'd never threatened him before. What was happening? Izuku felt a pain tighten in his chest as his heart thrummed. It kind of felt like it was going to pound out of his chest, to break his ribs from the inside. He felt really dizzy. He opened his eyes only to be met with fuzzy black static. Oh. He was passing out. Izuku let go. Izuku woke up later with a whimper. Everything hurt still and his whole body felt too hot and too weak and just all around awful. He was clammy and shaking. Throbs radiated up from his feet and over the skin on his arms. His thighs burned and he wasn't even totally sure what had happened to them but they hurt. The feeling of nails embedded in his feet felt just as stark as when the ants had first bit him. He had no idea how long it had been but it should have faded by now, right? This pain wasn't a permanent thing, right? Right? He threw his head over the edge of the bed. Vomit splattered into the bin that someone had placed with surprising precision. Like they knew that would happen. There was a pinching in his arm. Oh good, he was on an IV. He collapsed back to his pillow and wrapped his blankets into him tighter. He shivered violently. The thin blankets felt like they were doing nothing in the icy room. He couldn't do this. His mind swirled at the fuzzy memories. They'd broken their promise. They'd hurt him. He hadn't really been okay with it and they did it anyway. Izuku wanted to go home. He wanted Mom. He sobbed into his pillow. But there was no way out. He was stuck in this cycle. It was just pain. He was just a kid. Izuku wasn't a hero yet so he had no idea what he was supposed to do. Izuku stuttered in a breath. A light bulb flickered on in his mind. Izuku wasn't a hero, but he did know one. Kei could help. Kei would help. Izuku felt like his arms were dead fish with how much they flopped and felt painfully numb. Each movement sent a zing of pain, but overwhelmingly they felt detached from his body and impossible to control. It took some time, but Izuku was able to shimmy his way to the side of the bed and slide his hand between the mattresses. His hand shook as he pulled the feather out. Izuku felt his eyes flood with a new wave of tears at how hard it was to control his fingers. How all his attempts at Morse code were failures, just like him. It was useless. He couldn't get his fingers to work. Keigo probably wasn't even listening. Probably was too busy. Izuku was about to roll over, to forget about the whole thing. But he felt the feather twitch and vibrate in his hand. The way that it always did when something Izuku had said intrigued him. Right before Kei would ask a question. Izuku sobbed as he smiled. Of course Keigo was listening. He'd never not been willing to listen. Izuku took as deep of a breath as he really could and coughed a little. He really didn't feel good. But was more settled, so he was able to tap slowly in a way he prayed was close enough for Keigo to understand. You there, Kei? Always Izu? Izuku let out a loud wet sob. He felt so alone and like Keigo was right next to him at the same time. He curled his knees up towards his chest before he started trying to explain. He wanted to say everything, but he also was really tired. He was struggling to keep his eyes open as is and knew it would take too long and everything just hurt too much. So he started, hoping he could sum up. I can't. A wave of pain washed over Izuku, making his whole body flinch and spasm. His chest hurt and he was pretty sure that he just bit his tongue. The metallic tasting spit made him gag. Izuku rolled and only just made it to the bin in time before a wave of bile came up, stinging his throat. Izuku slammed back into the soft pillow under him. He was breathing heavily as his head spun. You can't what? Keigo always asked questions. Something squeezed in his chest. He coughed again, breathing heavily. Izuku wished Keigo was here. He wanted a hug. Not some imaginary made-up thing, but a real genuine hug. He bet Keigo gave great hugs. Maybe even on the same level as Mom. Izuku felt something in him break and an absolute wave of emotions flooded through him. Do this anymore. He felt as tears poured down his face. He scrambled to curl up tighter and tighter around the feather. It hurts. Make it stop. What hurts? More questions. He cares. Izuku sobbed as something warm and fuzzy bubbled up in his chest. Everything. Everything did hurt. The throbbing of his head, burning eyes, stinging arms, pounding crushed feeling in his chest, the rolling nausea, the acid burn in his throat and nose, the dull ache of all his joints, his feet that felt a bit like pincushions filled with hot coals, the list went on and on. It was overwhelming. Too much. Izuku wanted it to stop. He pressed the feather to his face, tight in his hands. He wanted to be closer to Kei. He wanted him to be here. Keigo could make it better. Izuku knew he could. Kei, please. Make it go away. I can't do this. They lied. They lied. It hurt. It hurts so much. Kei, please, Kei. Kei. I need you. Please make it stop. Make it stop. I can't do this. Izuku rambled, and at a point he wasn't even sure if he was even forming words. Maybe it was just babbles, mixed with wailing sobs. Izuku was too far gone to really care. He just was begging for some release, for help. At the edge of his awareness he felt the rushed tapping of the feather against his cheek, but he couldn't focus to decode the tapping into letters. He kept babbling and pleading to his hero for help. Slowly the soft tickling feeling of the feather lightly dusting his cheek brought him back to the present. Izuku sniffed and rubbed his eyes with a weirdly limp hand. It was more like slapping himself in the face repeatedly, but the tears were away from his eyes. It was so dark in his room it didn't really matter, but he liked to pretend he could see the welcoming crimson of the soft feather. With a trembling finger he tapped out his message. Sorry. It's fine. You okay? Izuku felt his face crumble as another wave of tears fell onto his pillow. He wasn't okay, and Izuku didn't think he'd been okay in months. Honestly, probably since his mom died. Ms. Komori was great, but she wasn't family. And then she disappeared. Izuku was so lonely. He hurt and felt sick and didn't want to be here anymore. He didn't know where to begin, so Izuku just stroked the feather in the same pattern that Kei had stroked his face. It was soothing. Izuku kinda zoned out on the feeling of the feather under his fingers. He shifted his legs trying to find a position that didn't send shooting pains through his feet. His knee hit a wet patch on his sheets. Izuku snaked his other hand down between the sheets and the crinkly gown. Reaching some bandages tied around his thighs, he started to gently poke around. The front of his thighs were drenched with sticky liquid. Oh. That's not good. He moved his hand to try to press down. That's what you do when you are bleeding, right? Izuku started to feel really dizzy again. Keigo might know what to do, he should ask. Izuku slowly blinked as he tapped out the message. Bleeding again. Where? Izuku felt the blood totally coat his hand. He sat up to try to press the blankets into his bandages. Izuku slumped his forearm onto his thighs with a hiss. His other hand held his tether to Keigo. He couldn't let go of that even as it bounced around sending messages. Where bleed? The tapping continued, but Izuku was feeling really lightheaded and nothing really made sense. The room was spinning. It was pitch black and there was no way for him to know which way was up. Izuku squeezed his eyes tight as he took quick breaths. His chest felt like it had a bunch of rubber bands around it. Each breath was harder than the one previous. He twisted back to face the feather, just a hair too fast. Gravity went haywire, shifting all over the place. The world went tumbling and took Izuku along for the ride. Flailing, Izuku tried to use his flopping numb arms to brace himself. His hands tightened into fists and he slammed into the soft wall. Oh wait, no, that was just his bed. Izuku was a little confused how his bed was suddenly now attached to the wall, but in a world of quirks anything was possible. Roll with the punches and all that. Izuku nodded to himself and patted around where he thought Keigo's feather was. He felt it under his fist. In two pieces. No, oh no, 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 this can't be happening. This can't be happening. K. He tried to tap the feather, get it to move, and it stayed lax, unmoving. Dead. Ice shot through his chest, and his breaths came out in a swift, sharp staccato beat. He couldn't lose his connection to his hero. He couldn't lose another person. He hadn't told Kei everything yet. He hadn't gotten a chance to tell him he was one of his favorite heroes now, if not his favorite. He never got to tell Kei that he saw him like a big brother, like family. He never got to hug him. Izuku felt a stabbing in his chest as his heart fluttered. He felt so sick. He was still dizzy even though he was pressed deeply into his pillow. He felt too hot and too cold as he was slick with sweat but shivering violently under the blankets. He wanted Kei. He wanted his brother. He tightened his shaking hand into a fist around the broken feather. Izuku moved his head to be as close to the small piece of Kei as he had. He felt tears dip onto the back of his hand. The broken feather tickled the side of his chin. Izuku's mind got even fuzzier. It was really hard to stay awake. Impossible even. He let his eyes slide closed. Maybe when he woke up Kei would be here and he could get that hug he so desperately wanted. In the back of Keigo's mind he knew that there was an alarm loudly blaring and lights flashing. His ears were ringing and he felt disoriented, but his world had narrowed to a pinprick. All he could hear was the soft huffing breaths and fast thrumming heartbeat. All he could see was the oily, sweaty hair plastered to the ghostly pale face. Under the flushed cheeks Keigo could just see the outlines of freckles. He hadn't realized Izuku had freckles. He didn't realize a lot of things about Izuku. It seemed, most important of all was how awful his situation had been. We need to go. The gruff voice was ignored. Keigo was focused on Izuku and anything else was irrelevant. All that mattered was watching to make sure the kid kept breathing. He watched the rise and fall of his small chest. Keigo wanted to reach forward and touch him but worried that if touched the boy would disappear. Like a bubble, so pretty but if you touch it, the beauty would pop. Keigo couldn't let Izuku pop, so he watched on, unblinking. A frustrated growl almost entered Keigo's awareness right before a large calloused hand grabbed the side of his face. The hand pushed and tried to turn his head. It was trying to turn his head away from Izuku. Keigo tried to fight the pressure, letting out a sharp, distressed call, but the hand was relentless. After a short struggle his neck gave way and was turned. His vision of his injured chickadee was replaced by the exhausted face of Eraserhead. Keigo. The hand shifted from his cheek to brush through Keigo's hair. Izuku needs you right now. You can't shut down. We don't have time for this. It was a feminine voice. Annoyed. Keigo felt himself frown. He should know this one. Keigo blinked a few times, feeling his brain come back online. Midnight. I know. 2 seconds, Nem. The hand squeezed the back of his neck in a tight pinch. Keigo gasped as everything clicked back into place. Eraserhead, Commission, Izuku. He flicked his eyes to the boy. They needed to get out of here yesterday. There was a tapping on his forehead, making Keigo send a glare at Eraserhead. Good, you look back. If you promise to keep it together, I'll let you carry him. Hawks nodded, before scooping Izuku into his arms. The kid was light, but not in a malnourished way, didn't get enough food, way. He was just so small. Midnight started out the door, her heels clicking loudly on the ground. Hawks pointedly ignored the 2 medical rooms as he started to sprint after her. The still light steps of Eraserhead behind him were barely audible under the loud alarm. He followed Midnight, who must have been getting directions as Keigo was getting turned around as all the hallways blended into a bland med center colored smear. Keigo looked down at the boy swaddled in his arms. He hated the way Izuku's arms and legs flopped with each pounding step. This couldn't be good for the boy, but there was no way that keeping Izuku here in the new 8th ring of hell would be better. There were too many times in Keigo's life that there was no good answer. It wasn't fair. Nothing about this was fair, but the cards were on the table and Keigo had to bluff his way, so maybe, just maybe, this time he could get the whole pot. Keigo didn't know what he would do if he didn't win this time, and that scared him. Hawks felt an arm wrap around his shoulder and he swung around into a roundhouse kick, rolling Izuku even closer to his chest. He was ready to fight anyone off who got in his or Izuku's way. It was Aizawa who'd touched him, and luckily for him the man had excellent reflexes as he ducked just in time. Keigo felt his wings relax at the sight of the man with his hands raised. He tilted his head towards the door he was holding open. He started waving his hand to usher him faster before he just reached forward and pulled Keigo into the room. It was a closet of some sort, with shelves of cleaning supplies and some brooms and mops in the corner. It was a tight fit for all 3 adults and Izuku. Midnight's back was pressed against one of the shelves with Hawks facing her, Izuku gently cradled between them. If it wasn't for the burn of chemicals in the air, he was sure he'd be able to smell her breath. Hawks could feel the crouched Eraserhead ducked down strangely between his tucked wings. He turned his head around to see the underground hero with his ear to the door, a look of pure focus on his face. After a moment he stood and stepped closer to Keigo, his chest brushing a few of his secondary feathers. He shivered. It felt a little weird to be this close. They passed us. We should quickly figure out where we are going from here. Keigo nodded before looking down at Izuku. The kid looked so unwell, his breathing hitching in a concerning way, and even unconscious. There was a pained wrinkle between his brows. Keigo tightened his grip on Izuku. It was uncomfortable in this closet, but it was much easier to listen to the halting breaths and fluttering heartbeat. He could almost ignore the other 2 adults pressed close to him as he looked down at the boy. Izuku seemed so small, curled up in Keigo's arms. So innocent. Keigo directed a few of his coverlet feathers to fly up and around to rest around Izuku's neck. It made the kid look like he was wearing a strange high-fashion feathered collar, but it let Keigo relax as he could feel the thready pulse and small puffs of air gently pass over the soft barbs. A spare feather was raised to brush Izuku's hair back from his forehead and stroke the top of Izuku's green hair. He could feel the small trembles that spread through the kid. If Keigo didn't need his feathers for fighting, he'd bundle the kid up in his long primaries and fluffy down to warm him up. A flash of rage burned through Keigo's chest. How could the Commission do this to a child? How could they take such a pure and innocent child and twist and bend and pull at them till they break like this? How could they live with themselves as they destroy the life of the sweetest child? How could the Commission have done all of this again? How did Keigo never see this coming? Keigo, are you listening? Aizawa barked out from behind him. Hawks blinked up and twisted his neck to look at him from the corner of his eye. Keigo had indeed not been listening, so he shook his head before turning to look back at Izuku. All his focus was on the child in his arms. Izuku's heart hiccuped in a way that sent a knife through Keigo's chest. His focus was on the dying child in his arms. How was Keigo able to focus on anything else? Could no one else see how Izuku was the most important thing right now? A soft hand clasped his arm. We agree with you, Keigo. Izuku is the most important right now. Keigo looked up to see the stressed face of Midnight. She looked so concerned, and her eyes held so much tension as they flicked back and forth looking into his own. He felt the hand rub up and down on his upper arm, another joined on the other side. Tension in his shoulders relaxed. He hadn't realized it was there until his shoulder collapsed downward. He blinked, suddenly feeling more centered. Midnight's voice was soft and lilting, her tone melodic. Keigo bet she was a great singer, but in the moment it made it easier to focus on. But I gotta be honest, kiddo, you are also not doing so hot either. Izuku needs your game. Okay. Keigo nodded. He could do this, he had to for Izuku. There is a whole cafeteria between us and the door where Hizashi is bringing the van to. Nedzu counted about 20 people hanging back to guard the door. It was dinner time when the alarm went off. The words swirled and spun in Keigo's head. After a few seconds they clicked into place. We go to that door. Why? Keigo's tongue felt heavy but he was able to push the words out around it. Closest door. The deep voice of Eraserhead came from behind Keigo. Next nearest is back to the roof, then after that is across the whole building. Keigo leaned his head down to bump his forehead against the crown of Izuku's head. He took a deep breath in. The thick smell of sour sweat filled Keigo's nose. There was the smallest faint tang of artificial strawberry scent, and he couldn't wait till the kid's head all smelled like shampoo. Keigo let out a little hum. Windows anywhere? For some reason that made Eraserhead let out a humorless snort. No windows for you to smash this time. Hawks sighed. That would be faster, but a lot of commission buildings had metal plating that would fall over any windows in case of emergency, so it wasn't much of a surprise. But fighting through 20 agents wouldn't be easy per se, but it wouldn't be the most complicated training exercise that had been asked of him. He wasn't handicapped. Well, Hawks looked down at his precious cargo. Not having hands is better than blindfolds or going wingless. Okay. I'm ready. Hawk's feathers flared. He was being scrutinized. He snapped his head and twisted his torso to look behind him. Eraserhead's tired, bloodshot eyes peeked out from under the flop of black fringe. The dark eyes were practically boring holes into the side of Hawk's face. Hawks narrowed his eyes. He knew this was an off-limit, predatory look, but he didn't care. He was a predator and sometimes he needed to make sure those around him knew that too. Eraserhead and Hawks were trapped in a staring contest. Hawks felt a zing of pride as his dominance display worked as Aizawa blinked and looked past Hawks' shoulder. The hero nodded before he turned to the door, grabbing his capture weapon. Eraserhead opened the door, slowly peeking his head out. He finished swinging the door open, holding it for Hawks and Midnight. Once the three heroes were out of the closet, they all started sprinting down the hallway. Hawks could smell the scent of food right as they turned a corner. There was a double door labeled Cafeteria, and in front of that door were two agents. One was a tall, thin man with dark skin and purple hair that looked almost like there was a small umbrella over his head. Next to him was a fairly plain-looking woman, tan skin, brown cropped hair, athletic build. There were no real indications of their quirks. Hawks sent sharpened feathers to pin their clothes against the wall. The woman started to struggle, her eyes glowing gold before her quirk was snuffed out by the red glowing eyes of Eraserhead. She growled as she tried to yank the fabric of her pants out from the feather. The man swung a hand out to press against the woman's chest. She stopped struggling, then turned to shoot him a confused look. The man turned to the heroes. His eyes tracked over all of them before landing on Izuku's unconscious form. Will you be able to keep him safe? Keigo froze at the man's question. He didn't understand what was going on. Of course. Aizawa seemed to know what was going on. Good. Hawks tightened his grip on the boy and let the other hero take the lead. They'll come for him, you know. They won't stop. He is too valuable. The man paused before tilting his head to the side. They'll be after you too. We're aware. What are you doing? The woman cut in with a hissing whisper. Pushing the man's arm off her chest, she started struggling against the feathers in the wall. Why aren't you? The man cut back in. Don't you think we've done enough? That made the woman pause before slumping against the wall. She had a complex expression flash across her face before she flicked her eyes down to the corner of the hallway. The man watched her for a moment before letting out a large sigh. He shook his head before he turned to the heroes, a glint of something in his dark eyes. he tilted his head towards the door. Good luck, heroes. Keigo didn't understand what was going on, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was getting Izuku out. Aizawa gave a curt nod before pushing the doors open. Midnight was right on his tail, and Hawks took up the rear. The doors crashed loudly against the wall, making the various agents immediately look up. A few had handguns, others raised glowing or flaming hands. Hawks sent a barrage of sharpened feathers, trapping as many arms and legs to the various tables and chairs spread throughout the cafeteria. Next to him, Eraserhead's hair raised, waving in the air as one of the agents looked at their hands, confused, before Eraserhead snapped his capture scarf to yank the agent off their feet. Midnight darted out and crossed her arms to grip the bottom of her shirt and yanked it over her head. The red lacy was almost immediately overtaken by the purple smoke that exploded out of her. A few of the agents closest to her fell to the ground with a series of thuds. Others towards the edges of her smoke bomb started wobbling on their knees before slumping into chairs or sinking slowly to the floor. The sound of soft snores were peppered between the grunts, slaps, and thumps of the fighting. Hawks focused on keeping the agents immobile while Eraserhead and Midnight quickly cleared the path to the door to the kitchen. Over the opening cut out in the wall with a serving counter, Hawks could see the large loading bay door in the back corner of the kitchen. Next to it was a smaller, human-sized door. He wanted to just up and fly Izuku out, but there were too many obstacles and Hawks couldn't be all that useful if he snapped his wing bones trying to fly through an industrial kitchen. An agent tried to sneak up on him from behind, but Hawks spun on the ball of one foot and beat his wings hard. The agent tumbled to the ground, and before they could spring back up, Hawks used more feathers to pin them to the floor. Looking back at the other heroes, Hawks couldn't help but be impressed. They were basically totally finished clearing out all the agents. One of the last agents swirled their arms around and all the purple gas was blown into the floor and out from the fighting area towards the walls. Only 4 agents were left standing. Hawks glanced over each one, looking for any weaknesses when he recognized one. Keigo saw red. Before he could even understand what was going on, Keigo was flying full speed with his legs out in front of him, giving the monster, a hefty kick to the face. The tall, muscular man rolled with the kick before turning to smirk at Keigo. His eyes lowered to Keigo's chest and the smirk twisted into the unholy grin Keigo saw in his nightmares. Looks like 2 of my favorite pets have become friends. Mr. Watanabe took a step forward, a sadistic grin stretched with excitement lighting his eyes. Keigo took a few scrambling steps back, tightening his hold onto Izuku. Keigo curled over the injured boy, flaring his wings and let out the loudest, most distressed screaming animalistic screech. Keigo needed him to back off. Instead of backing up, the man sauntered forward, slipping his hands into his pockets. Keigo let out a series of spitting hisses as he cowered over Izuku, a wing twisting around the 2 of them in an attempt to shield them from the man. "Oh, this is why you were always my favorite, baby bird." Keigo flinched at the man's cooing voice. His other wing circled the first, making a feathery cocoon. He could hear how Mr. Watanabe stepped ever closer. "You never lost that fire, never broke no matter how hard I tried." He reached in between Keigo's wings to force his head up. Keigo felt his heart thrum in his chest and his breathing stutter as he looked into the hard red eyes. The large hand shifted from under his chin to stroke through Izuku's sweaty hair. "My little puppy here reminds me of you that way." He frowned at Izuku, confusion dusting his face. "What did you do to him?" Keigo felt something in him snap. "What did you do to him?" He shot a leg out in a wide curve, knocking Mr. Watanabe off his feet and onto the floor. With a snap of his wings, Keigo stood over the man, a leg on his chest and a long primary feather, razor sharp, pointed against his throat. The man swallowed, bobbing his Adam's apple into the sharp point, and the feather softly caressed the curve in his throat. Keigo made a strangled scream down at him with an angry sneer. Mr. Watanabe smirked. "Oh, poor little Hawks with his little bird brain. Did you forget?" He reached up a hand to Keigo's ankle, his smirk twisting into his sick grin. "You can't hurt me." With that, Mr. Watanabe yanked Keigo's ankle to the side, knocking him off balance. He tried to keep himself upright but ended up stumbling back and falling to his back, his wings and arms trying to brace Izuku closer to his chest. The boy's breath stuttered at the impact. Keigo scrambled with his legs and wings, trying to get as far from the man who was stomping towards him. He couldn't seem to get his legs under him enough to stand, his arms still cradling Izuku, his wings fluttering across the floor trapped under him. Panic thrummed in Keigo. He needed to save Izuku, but he couldn't do much more than wiggle along the floor. Keigo heard an evil chuckle as he curled into the fetal position on his side, clutching Izuku to his chest. He screwed his eyes shut as he braced for the impact of a heavy steel-toed boot. It never came. Keigo snapped his eyes open to see Midnight, still shirtless, squatting with her arms out. "My quirk doesn't seem to affect him. Let me take Izuku to the van." Keigo wanted to cling tighter to the boy, but Hawks forced himself to let go with creaking joints. Midnight cradled the young boy against her chest and sprinted out of the facility. Keigo sat up only to see Eraserhead fighting Mr. Watanabe. They traded blows, back and forth, Eraserhead with the grace of a ballet dancer swirling and twirling as he connected to the other man's knee, chest and jaw. Mr. Watanabe was like a machine, heavy straightforward punches and kicks made with deadly precision. Crumpled on the floor, Keigo watched on in horror. He felt like a little kid again as his parents beat each other bloody while he watched from the cracks in the door of the closet. Like he was back in his training, knowing he was up next. He knew he was breathing too fast, but everything was too much. The lights overhead were bright and were buzzing. The sickly sweet smell of Midnight's quirk filtered through his gas mask. The sounds of the fighting with its grunts and thumps felt like thunder pounding in his ears. There was some grit on the tile floor under Keigo's balled-up fists. The scratchy fabric of the tactical suit itched where it touched his skin, the holes cut into the back of the shirt too tight around his wings. The neckline felt like it was choking him. Keigo. Keigo snapped his head up to see Eraserhead, his eyes glowing red, hair floating as he stared at Mr. Watanabe. His blood-stained capture weapon wrapped around the struggling man. Eraserhead nodded towards the man. "Feathers. Sharp. Go." His aim was off as his vision was watery from tears, but Keigo shot off a handful of feathers in the direction that Mr. Watanabe was. He would send out more, but he didn't want to hit Shota, or slice the capture weapon. There was a pained hiss, and Keigo blinked. The tears in his eyes rolled down his cheeks, clearing his vision. A thick trail of blood fell from the thin cut across Mr. Watanabe's cheek. A few slices across his clothes also had blood start to stain their edges red. The capture weapon was held by a thread between Eraserhead and Mr. Watanabe. The man's face filled with shock as he rubbed the cut on his gray shirt, smearing blood across his shoulder. Looking down at the red smear on his shirt, the man's wide eyes filled with genuine fear as he turned his head to Keigo. You actually cut me?" Mr. Watanabe's normally hard voice was wobbling and unsure. It made some sick part of Keigo swell with pride. Hawks stood, dusting off his knees as he unclipped the gas mask from his face. He tilted his head back and looked down the bridge of his nose. He grinned, big and wide and manic. "Oh," Hawks purred. "I have wanted to do that for years." Hawks pounced, a whole arsenal of his feathers sharp and flying next to him. He pounded the man into the ground. Cut after cut after cut after cut. Keigo watched, laughing. The bubbling euphoria of knowing he was finally free filled him with bliss. This was as good as flying high in the sky on a sunny day, better than the calming beach, and was incomparable to the joy of walking through a forest. He wanted to feel this way every day. Mr. Watanabe, under the barrage of feathers, was able to stumble back towards one of the two doors to the kitchen. He tumbled backwards through the swinging doors. Hawks stalked forward, only to be stopped by a hand on his shoulder. "Keigo, stop, we need to go." Hawks rolled Eraserhead's hand off his shoulder, but let himself be guided to the other door leading to the kitchen. Passing through the doors, Hawks froze from the sound of laughter. Mr. Watanabe, with his sandy hair a little mussed up and a few small splatters of blood on his face and arms, stood up on the other side of the room. He was lightly chuckling and clapping. "You got me once. Impressive, baby bird. But you are as much of a failure now as you were as a kid. Your quirk is nothing against a quirk like mine." Keigo raked his eyes up and down Mr. Watanabe. He looked smaller than Keigo remembered. The hard look in his eyes was clouded with insecurity. His hands shook slightly. His posture was ever so hunched. The smell of nervous sweat filled the air between the two. Keigo furrowed his brows before it clicked. Mr. Watanabe was scared. Keigo kicked his feet against the tiles as he ambled towards the man, and each little scuffing noise made Mr. Watanabe twitch and flinch ever so slightly. Keigo got nose to nose with the man. Mr. Watanabe's breath was rank as he huffed against Keigo's face. Keigo wanted to wrinkle his nose in disgust, but Hawks kept his face perfectly smooth. "You know Mr. Watanabe." Keigo reached over towards the knife block resting on the table next to them. He curled his fingers around a large chef's knife. "There is a lot more about life than quirks." The knife slid out of the block with a shing. Keigo arched the knife to slice through the soft front of Watanabe's neck. Keigo felt tight bands wrap around him and let himself get pulled back. His focus was on the burbling red cascading down Mr. Watanabe's front. The color matched his wide, scared eyes perfectly. The expression of horror washing over his now pale face made Keigo grin down as the man fell to his knees. Mr. Watanabe reached behind him and fell over. His arm flopped around to his front. He had a gun. Keigo flared his wings, shielding Shota with his hardened wings. Shots rang out in quick succession. Hot slicing pain flashed through Keigo. His leg. His left wing twice, then his right. 2 in his gut. The gun clicked and fell from the limp hand of Mr. Watanabe. There was a small upward twist of a smile on his dead face. Like he had had the last laugh. And from the way Keigo felt himself start to collapse to the floor, he might have. Strong arms looped from behind Keigo, keeping him from hitting the floor. "Easy, kid. I got you, you're okay." Shota's voice was unbearably soft as he slowly dragged the staggering Keigo across the kitchen out the now open loading bay door. Globs of red made the floor slick and slippery, but Shota's grip was firm and steady. In no time at all they were outside. Keigo's vision flicked as his eyelids started to feel really heavy, but in the flashes he saw the large van they had come here in. The back doors were open, and he could see Midnight sitting on Izuku, pushing down on his chest again and again. Keigo was confused until it clicked. He was in the van in milliseconds, screeching and clawing his way towards Izuku. Towards his kid. Tight bands tightened around his chest and wings were straining him, something deep in his gut twinged. Dull pain radiated, but he kept trying to get to Izuku, nothing could stop him. He was dying, and Keigo couldn't do anything. Hizashi. Drive. The whole world lurched and rumbled, but it didn't matter as long as he could get to Izuku. Stop, Keigo. Hey. Hands were pushing him against a lumpy wall, and he kicked out trying to get away and to Izuku. That is all that mattered. There was a grunt and a curse before a hand came up and slapped him in the face. It wasn't that hard, but it jarred something in Keigo, making him freeze. Sorry. Sit. Keigo let himself be guided down, watching in horror as Izuku's chest was crunched under Midnight's hands. Small sticky pads on Izuku's chest with wires trailing off to the side. Nedzu sitting by the boy's face with a resuscitator in his paws. The blue plastic bubble being pushed in an even rhythm. Hands came up to Keigo's chest and ripped his shirt down the front. The buttons dinged and plinked as they bounced the metal floor and benches. There was a confused noise as calloused hands gently poked at his stomach. Keigo flinched back a little. It tickled. Right. The deep voice muttered, healing Quirk. Keigo watched blankly as he heard the crunch of the bones in Izuku's chest, with the forced whoosh of blood. He listened as the blue bubble crinkled plastically as air whooshed into Izuku's lungs. After a moment of silence an electric zap went off. Izuku jolted. Only for the process to start again and again. Keigo. A soft hand combed through his hair. It was nice. It kept him from floating away. After a few strokes there was a deep sigh. Nem. Switch out. And maybe use your quirk on Keigo. We don't want him to freak out again. The hand left. He let out a distressed squawk, pawing his restrained hand towards where he thought it went. A different hand replaced it. It was thinner and a little colder. He wasn't sure how he felt about it until the sharp nails scratched his scalp in a heavenly way. He leaned into the scratching with a deep breath. The air was sickly sweet. His mind swam, suddenly dizzy. One of the thin hands caught him as he started to lilt to the side. Another electric zap sound, followed by some sputtering painful gasps. Oh, thank GD, we got a pulse. The soft feeling of lips being pressed to his temple lulled Keigo the rest of the way into a dreamless sleep. Good night, Keigo. Shota stood bent over Izuku, his fingers shaking as they pressed against the kid's neck. With each fluttering beat tapping against his fingers, Shota felt something slowly relax inside him. The pressure that had been building finally found some release. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, mentally counting each too fast beat. The van bounced, making Shota lurch and stumble. His arms snapped up to brace against the van wall. Sorry. Hisashi's voice was high-pitched and strained. Only a few more minutes. Minutes Shota couldn't help but worry that they wouldn't have. He was no doctor, but he was trained in hero-grade first aid, which was only a fine line below an EMT. Shota knew how to perform CPR and was well practiced, but he couldn't deny how in the aftermath his hands always shook, doubly so when it was on a child. Shota, as a hero, usually wasn't in charge this long. He would keep up with CPR until the actual full medical professionals could take over, letting Shota move on to the next person in need. It was almost unheard of for heroes to take the ambulance rides with a victim. Shota finally thought he understood why. Rescue and raids of this sort were already high pressure, adrenaline creating nightmares. But they were over and done surprisingly fast. They were a flashbang, hot and fast, leaving the heroes exhausted and needing to rest. But being in this van just watching the kid they'd done everything they could to save struggle to stay alive while not really being able to do anything was torture. It was like holding a piece of burning charcoal in his hand. He could only watch as his skin bubbled over and was full of pain and anxiety that had nowhere to go. It was a totally different experience and trying to do both back to back was exhausting. Shota found himself hoping that Izuku's abused and failing organs held out just a little bit longer. That his blood would make it one more circuit around his small body. That his rattling lungs would fill one more time. His fingers twitched wanting to do something more than monitor a pulse. He was an ambush hero. He was normally capable of incredible patience. But normally the instant Eraserhead was able to identify a problem he was able to jump in to help. He couldn't help here. Shota couldn't beat the kid's heart for him or push oxygen into his lungs, not really. CPR and rescue breaths were a poor substitute for the real thing. And even though the kid's vitals were much too low, they weren't zero. Not yet, not again. So he waited, frozen over the kid. Fully coiled, ready to spring into action the instant the kid tanked again. Pushing adrenaline through his body, the constant loud thumping of his own heart made it difficult to feel Izuku's weaker beat. Shota would give half of his healthy beats to the kid if that meant Izuku would make it. He swallowed and looked around the van, needing a small distraction. Since forcing Keigo to sleep, Nomori had been quiet as she sat with Keigo's head in her lap. She was lazily petting his head, making sure to lightly scratch the teen's head with her sharp nails. His face was relaxed and smooth, he looked so peaceful. Shota couldn't relate. A soft paw tapped his thigh. You did everything you could, Shota-kun. Yeah well. Shota crossed his arms with a grunt. He immediately regretted the loss of the tangible thrumming that proved Izuku was alive. It wasn't enough. Nedzu sighed. We're heroes, not miracle workers. Less than 24 hours ago we didn't even know that Izuku existed. But now we have him free from his captivity, and while he is not well, we are working to transfer him to someone who can help him recover. Shota's scruff prickled as he scratched the side of his face. He leaned forward, finally giving in to the urge to check the pulse. It was still like a hummingbird's wings, but it was still beating. Shota sighed before he crouched down next to the boy. Shota's voice cracked, it still wasn't enough. It is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not weakness, that is life. I hate that quote. Shota sent Nedzu a glare. You say it constantly. Stop it. I'll stop quoting it when you stop blaming yourself for being human. Shota reached up to rub his mouth, before mumbling to himself under his breath. Says the F-ing rat. Nedzu definitely heard his comment if the twitch of his ear and playful grin meant anything. He just patted Shota's knee. Ah, well, not all of us can be perfect, and even if you were somehow in need of atonement, which you are not, Izuku is just at the beginning of his journey. You will have time to continue to help him, to make up for your self-assigned blame. You have a lot of faith he will make it. I have faith in my staff and their pure stubbornness to squeeze life hard enough to force out miracles. He's made it this far, we can get him the rest of the way. Shota pursed his lips. He ran a hand through Izuku's sweaty hair, then checked his pulse and breathing again. Both were still there. Hold on, I'm turning into UA now. Hizashi called out loudly from the front. Shota threw himself over the kid just in time for Hizashi to yank the car into a tight 90-degree turn. The jostling rolled the kid's head. His mouth was slightly open and a string of drool started to pool onto the bench below him. The van bounced a bit before it screeched to a halt. Shota was up and opening the back before the van fully stopped, and he stumbled forward at the final kickback. Recovery Girl was just exiting the door to Ua with a gurney. Shota jumped out and practically threw the gurney against the bumper. Namori was ready with a cradled Izuku and lowered him gently onto the medical mattress. Nedzu jumped onto the bed and sat by Izuku's head, one paw pressed against the child's neck, the other held the IV they had left in, once reading the label stating it was saline just solution. The kid needed all the fluids he could get. Shota felt glued to the ground as he watched Midnight sprinting with the gurney into UA. Recovery Girl was right on her heels. There was a slam of a car door and Hizashi appeared. Hizashi ran a hand over his gold hair. Hizashi turned in a tight little circle before he started madly kicking the back tire of the van repeatedly. Distantly, Shota was glad his fiance was wearing steel-toed boots or he would be breaking his own toes. GD, kick. F, ing, kick. D, it, kick. Kick, kick. Shota shifted closer to Hizashi, his hands raised in a piss-poor attempt to calm him down. Hizashi, now is not the time. I'm going to kill them. His green eyes practically glowed with righteous anger. If that boy dies, again, I'm going to kill them all. Keigo already did. Shota's voice was dull and lifeless. He shrugged. Well, he got one for sure. I wasn't really paying attention to everything. He could have easily gotten others with his quirk and I wouldn't know. What? Hizashi froze mid-kick before twisting so fast he lost his balance and awkwardly caught himself on the side of the van. What? What all even happened back there? Not now, we should get Keigo to the infirmary. He seems fine at the moment but he was shot. At least 3 times that I could see. Hizashi rubbed his forehead before he shook his head. GD, this is a show, you have no idea. Shota stepped up into the van after Hizashi. Keigo was still very much asleep and bundled up in the remaining half of Shota's capture weapon. Shota laid a hand on Keigo's blood-splattered hair. The small frown on the kid's face faded at the touch. It was obvious that he liked his hair messed with. Shota had used that fact a lot to his advantage already. He would have to apologize for it later. Or maybe he wouldn't and just use it for the next time the kid had a breakdown. Shota's shoulders slumped as he wished it was an if and not a when. He didn't know everything Keigo had gone through, but if the overheard conversation with the Mr. Watanabe character was anything to go by, it was clear that the parallels between Izuku and Keigo were more than he'd originally thought. It made Keigo's ability to keep it as together as he did as impressive as it was worrying. Honestly, Zashi, it wasn't as bad as I thought it'd go. He paused, reevaluating his statement. Well, barring the murder. Barring the... Hizashi cut himself off. His head collapsed down into his hands. He took a few deep breaths before a small wobbly voice came from between his palms. I'm so sorry, Sho. Shota guided his chin up with a gentle hand so he could really look at his fiancé. Hizashi looked wrecked. His blonde hair looked like he had run his hands over it 1,000 times. His green eyes were bloodshot with drying tear tracks under them. The pinched expression felt wrong on his face. With his middle finger and thumb, Shota flicked his fiancé's forehead with a short grunt. Hizashi pushed the hand away. No, I'm being serious here, Sho. I couldn't be there for you. He took an unsteady breath. When I heard the gunfire over the radio, I had the thought, I might never get to see him again. I'm right here. Shota put a hand on Hizashi's cheek. I know. Hizashi leaned into the hand and brought his own up over it. I love you. Shota rarely said those words, but that didn't mean he didn't mean it any less. And Hizashi was closer in his thinking than Shota would like to admit. If Keigo hadn't blocked all the bullets with his own body, there was a chance Shota would be in the infirmary next to Izuku, if not worse off. They had all been incredibly lucky with this whole thing, and leaving anything unsaid was just illogical. Shota might need to say it more often with the way Hizashi's whole demeanor lightened, like a huge weight was taken off of his shoulders. I love you, too. Hizashi leaned forward to peck a kiss on Shota's cheek, and then went in for another, and then another. Shota shoved Hizashi's head away, rolling his eyes. But he couldn't fully smother the small smile that grew across his face. Okay, but we do actually need to get going. Keigo needs to be checked over still, and Recovery Girl might need help. She doesn't have a medical team, it's just us. Oh, right, I didn't even think about that. Usually we are done once we hand victims off. I know, it's a bit weird. Hizashi bent over and picked up Keigo's legs, and Shota wiggled his hands under his bound arms. It was a bit of an awkward shuffle for them, but Hizashi had parked the van to the closest door to the infirmary. So in no time at all Shota was using his elbow to open the door. The lack of immediate cacophony and complete lack of yelling made him relax, but left him nervous. He needed to know the kid was still alive. He twisted his neck to look behind him. Izuku was hooked up to a handful of different medical equipment. Wires trailed out from the collar of an oversized UA gym t-shirt, hooked into the side of a screen with his vitals scrolling across. An air mask was held over his nose with a thin band of elastic. His finger had a pulse oximeter clamped over it. He had what seemed to be a new bag of saline going into one of his IVs. The boy now had a second one in his other arm, which was attached to Nomori instead of another bag. She was laying on the bed next to Izuku, her arms stretched out, slowly squeezing a stress ball. Recovery Girl had a serious expression, but was calm and collected as she wiped antiseptic over the boy's still bleeding legs. She frowned at the pad as the oozing blood dyed it red. Nedzu rolled a cart closer to Recovery Girl. A suture kit and rolls of bandages and some various ointments laid out on it. The principal gestured to one of the empty beds across from the kid. You may place Keigo-kun over there. Shota nodded, grunting lightly as he and Hizashi hoisted the young hero onto the medical bed. Blood types. What are they? Recovery Girl didn't look up from her well-practiced stitches. Shota was a little mesmerized by her quick, precise hand movements. It almost looked like her fingers were dancing along Izuku's skin. Both B. I'm negative, shows positive. Hizashi stepped to stand next to the still frozen Shota. His fingers slid between Shota's. Will that work? No, Recovery Girl sighed. The kid here needs blood. For some reason he isn't clotting right. He has some chemical burns on his legs, so they might have put some anticoagulant on him, or maybe he's just hemophilic. I'm working blind and on a pretty intense time crunch. So I was hoping I could get another donor so I could replace what he'd lost with healthy, non-contaminated blood. It's okay. Nomori grinned from her bed. I'm universal, so I got this. We are not bleeding you dry. He might end up needing more than I can safely take from you. She tied off the thread before switching to the other side, starting on the other leg. We'll have to come up with a better solution if he doesn't stop bleeding soon. Vlad might have some sources. Shota mumbled. I will message him. Nedzu pulled his phone out of his waistcoat. Any other immediate concerns we could help with, Chio-san? More concerns than I'd like to count, but not much we can do but monitor and wait. The fluid and blood has already dramatically improved his blood pressure. It's far from healthy, but it seems to only be improving. The slight fever I will keep an eye on until I can do some tests for possible infections. You could maybe start looking for methods to get good antibiotics and pain meds under the table. Nedzu nodded and typed something out on his phone quickly, then slid it back into his waistcoat. Recovery Girl finished stitching up the other leg quicker, tying it off. While she bandaged it, Shota wondered how she decided which of the cuts needed stitches and which didn't, as they all looked bad. She stripped her bloody gloves off and immediately slid on a new pair. She squeezed some tube of ointment onto her fingers before reaching to gently rub it into his arms. I'm fairly sure that these are some form of sting. It's similar to a jellyfish or poison ivy if I was to hazard a guess. From how raised and inflamed it is, I worry about a larger histamine response. Same with what looks like possible spider bites on his legs. Shota felt Hizashi shudder at the mention of spiders, and started rubbing small circles onto the back of his hand with his thumb. At this point my goal is to just keep him stable until the tests finish and his stamina is higher so I can use my quirk on him. Until I know more, there isn't much I can do here beyond that. Recovery girl switched from rubbing the ointment on his arms to his legs. She was extra gentle with the obviously broken one. Once his vitals are a little better, I plan to get him some x-rays. He definitely has a broken leg and probably some rib fractures from the CPR, and who knows what else. So, is he going to be okay? Shota's voice was strangely hoarse and strained. He knew his question was a bit redundant, but the long explanation was making his exhausted mind swim. Hisashi's hand squeezed his and Shota squeezed back. I can't make any promises at this point, but I'll do my best. You were already doing us a great service, Chiyo-san. Nedzu bowed to her and Recovery Girl waved him off. What kind of doctor or hero would I be if I turned a child away out of some concern for my comfort? I would happily fight in the courts if the HPSC came after me for this. She paused her ministrations for a moment before continuing. Honestly, after all of this, I'd love to give them more than just a piece of my mind. The energy in the room slid into something sharp and aggressive. They all were out for blood. Shota knew he wanted to rain hellfire down on the commission, so the others likely were mentally planning ever increasingly painful murders. It would be justified for what they were complicit in doing. Shota slid his eyes from the sickly-looking Izuku to the sleeping Keigo. He still looked peaceful, wrapped in the remaining half of the capture scarf. Keigo had rained a bit of hell onto the commission, or at least that one agent. Shota vividly remembered watching the capture weapon be totally shredded under the violent barrage of feathers. The small gray scraps had burst out from the explosion of red like rocks and ash off a volcanic eruption. The kid in that moment had been a force of nature, unrelenting, unstoppable, and terrifying. The manic laughter still echoed in Shota's mind, sending some ice through his chest. He needed more information. He didn't want to pass judgment until he understood what had happened. Keigo was in for a long list of questions that Shota wouldn't let him squirm his way out of when he woke up. If Shota was going to have to testify that whatever that was totally legal, it better have been at least justified. Shota pulled out the file from his shirt, cringing a bit at the blood that had soaked into the manila folder and along the edges of the pages. He handed it to Nedzu. I collected these. They looked like files on Izuku. Thought they might be useful. Thank you, Shota-kun. Nedzu chittered a little and looked giddy as he cracked open the file and started to read. Also, I should mention, Keigo was shot. Recovery Girl let out a strangled noise and ran over to Keigo's bedside. Shota was quick to add. But he seems fine now. I'll be the judge of that. Now, where? I saw 3 of 6 shots make contact. Stomach, left wing, right thigh. Recovery Girl twisted the capture weapon to make it loosen its coils and pulled open Keigo's already ripped open shirt. She used an antiseptic wipe to clean off some of the dried blood. She paused at the lack of bullet holes. If Shota squinted, he could almost see the faint scar where he had seen Keigo get hit. Recovery Girl moved to the leg and then the wing. No injuries were found. Shota was startled as she grabbed his chin and poked his broken nose. He braced for pain only for it to never come. Shota blinked a few times, poking at his own painless nose while Recovery Girl turned to look at Izuku. Impressive. Even in this state he is using his quirk. Actually, Nedzu flipped a page of the file, the normally present smile concerningly absent. If what this file says is true, Izuku-kun's quirk is likely at its very strongest. He held a page out to Recovery Girl. Here is the plan for his procedure labeled today's date. It doesn't have an explanation of the cuts on his thighs. But there is a handwritten note stating that additional input was required. Shota watched the elderly hero skim the page with pursed lips. She nodded and practically threw the page back to Nedzu. I'm going to need to do research. I don't know anything about bullet ant or Portuguese man-of-war stings. But large amounts of any type of venom or toxin would likely make the hypovolemic shock worse, leading to cardiac arrest. Might explain the fever too if he is having a reaction. All of this might end up having some long-lasting consequences, and I'd like to know what to expect. She turned with a sigh, looking over to Nomori, who was looking a little pale and starting to breathe a little heavier than normal. And you, Missy, are done. Recovery Girl started towards the heroine only for Nomori to turn, moving her arm away. Oh, no, I'm fine. Nomori blinked heavily. I can take it, I'm fine. No, you aren't. Don't lie. I like to limit the number of passed out individuals in my infirmary. I left you for too long already, so you are a few minutes from making that number rise to 3. She held out a hand. Arm. Now. Namori pouted a little before she passed her arm to the healer. Her IV was taken out efficiently, and after the bandage was pressed into the crook of her arm, Recovery Girl squeezed her shoulder. You've done enough. He is safe. Izuku is not like last time. You made it in time. You gave part of yourself to make sure he'd make it. I'll take it from here, okay? You did it. Recovery Girl's voice was soft in a way Shota had never heard before. Nemori's eyes filled with tears. Shota turned away, feeling like he was intruding on something private. Hizashi roped an arm around his shoulders and pulled them closer together. Now, Recovery Girl clapped, her voice back to normal. She pulled out a basket of various sweet electrolyte drinks and held it out to Namori, who was still wiping her eyes. Drink this and sleep if you feel you need it. After Namori took an electric blue bottle, Recovery Girl turned to Shota and held out the basket. No, Shota hated the flavor of those drinks. He'd rather just eat a jelly packet, so much better. Hizashi thought it was ridiculous as he claimed they tasted the same artificial sweet flavor, chemically parading as fruit. But he was wrong, these were disgusting. I'm not taking no for an answer. I have no idea how Izuku's quirk works, but lots of healing quirks work off of stamina, and if his quirk used any of your own, you are likely 2 seconds from collapsing. You have been running yourself particularly ragged this past week. And I'm not risking it. Now. Sit. Grabbing a red one with a frown, took a sip and grimaced. The red was the most bearable, but it was still bad. Don't you dare make that face, Sonny. And be glad Izuku healed any injuries I'm sure you got on this raid, or you would have gotten an earful. I didn't get hurt, actually, thanks for asking. Good for you, it's a first. Shota resented that. He didn't get injured all the time, he just was in a more dangerous sector of heroism than the rest of the UA faculty. So it looked like he was a reckless idiot. But compared to his underground peers, he was actually far more cautious and less prone to injury. He was about to open his mouth to say just that when Recovery Girl raised a finger. Before you try to use it again to get out of a lecture, I am very proud of your efforts to quit smoking. Keep on that, but don't expect it to get you out of lectures. I am a teacher too. You know I can tell when someone is trying to distract me from the main point. You might have thought you were slick last time, but it was obvious what you were doing. Namori openly cackled from across the room as Shota felt himself flush. Part of Shota wished he could just be swallowed up by the floor. Or maybe punch Recovery Girl. He was split 50-50. You're trying to quit smoking? Hizashi shot Shota a bright grin, then kissed him on the cheek. I'm so proud of you. It's been like a day. Calm down. Still proud. He went in for another kiss and Shota caught him and pushed Hizashi's head away, feeling a feedback loop of embarrassment as the blush deepened. Shota then let himself get pushed into the bed so he could cover his face with the thin medical blanket. Namori started laughing even harder at the action, and Hizashi's cough was definitely him covering up a laugh. Traitor. Shota curled the edge of the blanket down to glare at his fiancé and friend, only making both of them dissolve into another giggle fit. Stop glaring at them and sleep. Recovery Girl shook her heavy needle-shaped cane at him, and if you don't at least try, I will whack you over the head to make you. What happened to limiting the number of unconscious patients? Shota sassed back. For you, Shota, I'll make an exception. I feel honored. Shota rolled his eyes as he shifted, trying to get comfortable on the thin medical cot. Hizashi leaned down to squeeze his shoulder with a smile. Rest, love. I'm going to head off to plan next steps with Nedzu. We'll figure it all out while you nap, okay? You've done your part. Shota sighed. Don't let him take over the world, or burn everything to the ground. I would like to still have a society when I wake up, okay? Aye, cap in. Hizashi did an overly dramatic salute and then winked. Don't worry, I'll keep him in check. I was talking to Nedzu. Shota failed to deadpan as a small smirk slipped out at Hizashi's betrayed squawk. You wound me, Sho. My own fiancé. Hizashi dramatically clutched his heart and sank to the floor. You think I'd do that? If given the chance? Absolutely. I rein you and Nedzu in. He closed his eyes with a smile. But I am tired and under doctor's orders to nap, so I'm gonna. He paused for a moment before opening his eyes back open. Also, I want to see them all burn. So, go crazy. Have fun. Shota let his eyes slide shut and let out a sigh, letting the breath take all of the remaining tension in his body. He hadn't realized how tired he was until he almost immediately slid towards sleep. The sound of Hisashi's warm chuckle and soft lips on his forehead lulled Shota the rest of the way into a dreamless sleep. Aizawa knew that this conversation was already overdue. He'd told himself that he would have it the moment that Keigo woke up. But that was days ago at this point, and he really couldn't keep putting it off. But every time he would open his mouth to try, Shota just couldn't bring himself to say anything. Not with how the kid was acting. Since waking up, Keigo had been a ghost, just silently haunting the infirmary. Shota could count on one hand how many words he had heard from him in the past 3 days. The kid might not be naturally as chatty as his hero persona, but this seemed abnormal from what Shota had come to expect from him. It was also uncanny how silent he was in everything he did, or more realistically, didn't do. After startling Recovery Girl a few times by silently sneaking up behind her, she had placed a stool for him to perch on. And perch he did. He sat like a gargoyle silently watching over Izuku, only really leaving that first day when Hisashi had somehow convinced the kid to take a proper shower. It had been a whole 7 minutes and Keigo left large puddles under his still dripping wings, but they'd all taken it as a win since he was no longer covered in blood and smelled of old sweat. Those who were in the know about Izuku had been taking turns sitting with Keigo. At first it was out of concern that Keigo would lose it, again, if Izuku's condition took a turn for the worse. They had genuinely been concerned he would attack Recovery Girl, and she begrudgingly agreed that she couldn't fight off panicking hawks and treat Izuku at the same time. But as the days passed and Izuku's vitals raised from critical to almost passable, the babysitter duty switched from protection to just caretaking. Keigo seemed totally unaware of the passage of time. They made sure to bring him food, reminded him to drink water, and sometimes forced him to go to the attached bathroom. No matter how many times they tried to explain that Izuku was improving and was well on his way to healing and no longer in any serious danger, it just didn't sink in. Shota would bet money that Keigo would only really relax the moment he got to see the kid's green eyes. He tried to convince the kid to sleep a little, but the piercing golden gaze just peeked out from under the thin medical blankets. Shota figured just laying down might at least let the kid's body take a break from his tight ball on the stool, so he let him watch Izuku all night long from the bed. Last time he'd seen Nomori, she'd been muttering under her breath about idiot children and forced nap times, so Shota knew that if he didn't sleep soon under his own volition, he'd be forced to. Quirk's sleep wasn't as restful as natural sleep, but at this point any amount would be better than zero. Trying to pretend that a portion of the faculty wasn't on edge was also becoming more and more of a challenge. Midnight had been subdued and looked like a zombie from blood loss she couldn't explain. Hisashi had a dangerous edge to everything he did that normally was fully hidden under his bubbly hero persona, and even the first years were even gossiping about it. Recovery Girl had cordoned off the infirmary, making injured students meet her in the classroom next door. She was a little shifty every time she had to lie, stating there was a case of a contagious and embarrassing Quirk accident victim. She was obviously having a little fun and was coming up with worse and weirder things to keep the students from prying. Nedzu luckily could just hole himself away in his office as he was one to do, especially in the winter, claiming hibernation. For Shota, he found himself just a little distracted and on edge. It didn't help that he happened to have 2 green-haired students and a student with a transformation quirk that let her turn into a large vibrant red dog. A dog the same shade as Keigo's wings. So during class, green or red would flash at the corner of his eye and he would think that maybe that was the kids that were constantly on his mind, only to twist around and get a funny look from his students. The thinking was totally illogical. Even if Izuku woke up, there was no way the kid would be up and moving, and Keigo was practically welded to Izuku at this point. So Shota found himself having a shorter and shorter fuse as he got more frustrated at himself each time his heart raced at a silly flash of color. It also didn't help that there had been no consequences for their nightmare raid as of yet. A man was dead, many more were injured, they had stolen files and a child out from the HPSC facility, and their response has been distressingly absent. There was no way that the commission didn't know who was responsible. They didn't really try to hide that Eraserhead and Midnight were on the raid. Nedzu's involvement could be inferred from the camera hacking, so the fact it had been 3 whole days and nothing had happened was stressing everyone out. Hizashi and Nedzu had shown Shota their massive logic tree map of plans, backups, and contingencies for every conceivable path and action the commission could take. It was beyond comprehensive and was clearly their way of dealing with the anxiety of not knowing what was to come. Shota had nodded along, committing none of it to memory. Shota knew he was a smart guy, but even he knew he was leagues behind Hizashi, not even mentioning Nedzu. All the moving parts and squirrely paths left him with a headache. Once a path was decided on, he would gladly fall in line and take action to keep the dominoes from falling on their heads. Until then, Shota would lovingly let his fiance's stress talk though Plan 722 for the third time as he sipped at his cup of tea while Eraserhead spent his patrols looking over his shoulder and kept an ear out for more information. Which brought Shota back to why he was practically dragging his feet to get to the infirmary. He growled to himself as he tucked his face deeper into his capture weapon, hiding a nasty scowl. A few students that were still in the halls scattered, one slamming face first into the wall, before all disappearing into classrooms. Shota couldn't deny that it was a little fun to be the scary teacher of UA. If you are quite done frightening the student body, we should get to Keigo-kun. Shota blankly looked out of the corner of his eyes at Nedzu, who was looking much too pleased with himself to be sassing the person who was giving him a ride. I think there are a few more students I could scare before we head there. Shota-kun. Nedzu's voice was ever so clipped. Shota knew he was at the end of the road. Fine. Nedzu had the audacity to pat Shota on his cheek before hunkering back down into the slightly pink-stained capture scarf. It was his backup for school as it wasn't blood-stained, but instead got put in the wash with one of Hizashi's bright red vintage outfits that stained anything put with it. So far no student has been brave enough to do more than look at it a little confused. Anyone who does ask will get extra credit. But Shota in this moment wished he could just punt his boss into the sun for more than just the condescending little pat. Shota didn't want to do this, and was pretty sure it was a bad idea to push the very obviously traumatized kid into talking before he was ready. But it had already been 3 days and they did really need more information. Additionally, on paper the kid did commit a fairly serious crime and as heroes they should be passing this investigation to police detectives, but they were trying to keep this in-house as much as they could. Shota had tried to argue that Hizashi or Nomori would be a better pick for this conversation. They were better at working with traumatized civilians. Telling Nedzu that Shota was usually more of a guy who is brought in for intimidation would not work in this situation. Unfortunately, Nedzu was able to talk circles around all of Shota's very logical talking points. Which is how Shota found himself in the infirmary, staring at the petrified kid, wondering where his ability to speak went. His mouth felt dry. His hands were a little sweaty, and Shota had a sinking feeling in his gut about how this was going to go. Shota was not what most would consider sociable. He was blunt, aggressive, and didn't have the energy for normal pleasantries. And Shota would be the first to tell anyone that he was far from the most empathetic. Shota was known for ruffling feathers, and the kid had a lot of feathers to ruffle. He knew that he was going to mess this conversation up and somehow push the kid over the edge that he was holding onto with nothing but his fingernails. A small paw poked at Shota's jaw, a little warning to get moving. Shota glared down at the beady little eyes that glinted up at Shota from the folds of the capture weapon. Nedzu could hold his f***ing horses. Shota was already being forced to do this even with every fiber of his being screaming at him that this was a bad idea. Instead of chilling out, Nedzu reached up his second paw and started kneading at his jaw. Shota growled before swatting the little paws away from his face. Shota sighed. He might as well get this show on the road if Nedzu was going to be annoying. Keigo. The kid's wings started to fidget, and he ever so slightly straightened his back. Shota took that as a sign that he was listening, even though his eyes never left Izuku. We have a few questions. Can we chat? For a split second Keigo's gold eyes flicked to Shota before darting back to Izuku like a compass finding magnetic north. After a beat, Keigo gave the slowest nod as he chewed on his bottom lip. Thanks, kid. Shota moved a stool to be next to Keigo. Sitting, he studied the kid. The sharp eyes had deep purple rings under them. His body was filled to the brim with tension, and small scratches were in the wood seat of the stool from his tight grip. His feet were perched on the top rungs, his back hunched and his wings were held a little from his back. The feathers were puffed and randomly a handful of individual feathers would shake. Keigo's blank yet expressive face twisted and pulled something in Shota's chest. His eyebrows were ever so slightly downturned, angry. But the illusion of anger was totally undercut from the wide, scared eyes. The desire to just wrap the kid in blankets and hold him was strong. He'd gladly take every single burden off of Keigo's back. He'd obviously been carrying them for too long and needed a break. No one that young should be that world-weary. "How are you doing?" That was not the question Shota had originally planned to say, but it slipped out. Keigo just let out the longest, saddest sigh before shrugging. He slumped forward even more to press a cheek into his knee. One arm wrapped around the knee, while the other reached up only to get tangled up in his hair, fidgeting with it lazily. "I'd like to apologize." Keigo's face screwed up in confusion before he turned his head to look at Shota, squishing his cheek further into his knee. His wide gold eyes slowly blinked at Shota for a whole 10 painfully awkward seconds before he shifted back to Izuku. While the prolonged eye contact made Shota feel like there were thousands of millipedes crawling over his skin, he couldn't deny that Keigo had looked cute. His voice was gravely from lack of use, but getting the kid to say anything felt like a major win. Shota vaguely gestured to Keigo's hand in his own hair. "During the raid I kept combing back your hair, using your enjoyment of head rubs to my advantage. I never asked if it was okay, and I probably should have." Shota mentally cringed as he gave a small bow, feeling Nezu had to cling to his shoulder. Served the rat right for forcing this to happen. Shota sounded so awkward. He felt so awkward. This was so incredibly awkward, and Shota would rather teach in Midnight's hero suit for a month straight than be here doing this. Keigo seemed to not really feel the same level of mortification as he just kinda froze. His hand tightening around a handful of the thin feathers mixed in between his dirty blonde hair. Shota couldn't react fast enough as the kid violently ripped the feathers out. Shota grabbed Keigo's hand, the dirty blonde feathers doing little flips and twirls as they calmly flitted to the floor. Hey, gentle." Shota moved closer, shifting Keigo's hair around a bit to check to see if he was bleeding. He wasn't, but his scalp didn't look happy about it. As Shota flipped the hair back, Keigo shivered a bit. "Sorry," Shota mumbled, feeling worse. Keigo shrugged. Fine. Feels nice." "Do you want me to?" Shota trailed off with his hand raised. Before Shota could second-guess himself, Keigo snapped into action, forcefully smacking Shota's hand to his scalp. The kid seemed to realize what he did, and with wide eyes, pushed it away with a high-pitched hawk-like call. After a second, Shota saw Keigo look longingly at Shota's half-raised hand. "I don't mind." Keigo snapped his eyes up to meet Shota's. The stare was intense and unblinking. It made Shota squirm. "If you want me to, I wouldn't mind. I play with Hisashi's hair a lot, and well, if you don't want me to, I also am fine with that too. We can forget I." Keigo once again snatched Shota's hand out of the air, but this time placed it much more gently into his hair. He patted the back of Shota's hand like he was apologizing for partially punching Shota's hand into his own head. Shota let out a little laugh. "Okay. Let me move my stool." Shota moved to sit behind him. Keigo was practically vibrating, and the expression on his face could only be described as emotionally constipated. Excitement, anxiety, fear, delight, and apprehension fought for dominance until it was all replaced with bliss the moment Shota started running his fingers through his feathered hair. The tension slowly evaporated with each stroke. One feather that was close to the patch Keigo had ripped out was stuck at an awkward angle. Gently, Shota coaxed it to smooth back into the slight cowlick the kid had. The moment the feather flowed back into the rest of the hair, Keigo melted. It was almost like the thin strings that were holding him up snapped. He slumped back into Shota's chest with a soft screeching coo. It was a little hard to reach around the wings to play with his hair, but the small delighted bird sounds and soft sighs made the discomfort worth it. After a few minutes, Keigo spoke, a little slurred. "Thanks. Am not supposed to do that." That made Shota frown. "No problem, you obviously needed it." Shota used his nails to brush wavy lines against Keigo's scalp. Something twisted in Shota's gut when Keigo bit back another delighted whistling screech. Keigo shook his head and hummed. "Shouldn't be a bird, it's weird and creepy." "Who told you that?" Keigo, "Dunno," he shrugged. "Everybody, I guess." "Well, I don't think it is weird or creepy. He thought it was sweet and cute, but you wouldn't catch him saying that out loud. I doubt anyone at UA would think that either. They're just too polite to say it. I know it's true. What about me? I actually like it. Don't count. You're weird and creepy, but by choice, not by nature. Shota snorted. Thanks, kid. Tell me how you really feel. Boost my self-esteem. The most spastic squawking screech of a laugh tore out of Keigo. It was a strange mix of human laughter and bird calls. It startled Shota. He had heard hawks laugh previously and it had seemed totally genuine, but after hearing Keigo's ugly but authentic laugh, that fake laugh paled in comparison. Shota couldn't hold back the smile, as he reached up and pulled on one of Keigo's earlobes. It only set the kid off again into a cackle. It was adorable, sue him, and it was relieving to see the kid make so much noise. After Keigo settled, Shota started combing his fingers through his hair. He didn't want to ruin the kid's mood, but he did still need information. So, did that man from the raid tell you you were weird and creepy? Keigo tensed before his shoulders sagged. His wings fell to rest on the floor between their two stools. He nodded. What else did he say to you? Growing up he called me a dumb bird, that I'd be an awful hero, that I am a failure. Keigo's voice wavered. He called me his pet. Shota felt a bit sick. He'd caught some of that from the fight, but in this calm atmosphere it felt more wrong somehow. I'm sorry he said all that to you. None of it is true. I hope you know that. Keigo shrugged. Well, that was something to work on with the kid. I know I should feel guilty. Keigo's voice was soft, but all I can feel is relieved. Why do you think that you should feel guilty? I'm a hero. Heroes don't kill people? Keigo's voice held the teenage, no duh, tone. I killed Mr. Watanabe. I should go to jail, right? Shota hummed. If a child who had been beat down daily by their guardian one day snapped and killed the adult in an attempt to get away, then what would the court's likely sentence? I dunno, jail time. No, Shota frowned. Hero courses all go over this sort of law. Keigo should know this. This is placed under preemptive self-defense. In severe abuse, if it is reasonable for the victim to expect more abuse from a guardian, then taking action, even violent action, to subdue and get away isn't charged as murder, even if they die. The highest charge might be that of manslaughter depending on the situation. Most of the time the child is given mandatory therapy and community service. I'm not a child, I never said you were. You call me kid all the time. That's because you are. Keigo let out a frustrated huff. That doesn't make any sense. How am I not a child but I am a kid? I dunno, I don't make the rules. But you. Keigo rolled his head back to look up at Shota. You think I wouldn't go to jail? I can't say either way, Keigo. I'm not a lawyer, but from what I saw Mr. Watanabe had a gun, shot you and you killed him in pure self-defense. You only lived because of Izuku's quirk. That's not the order that happened and you know it. Do I? Shota raised an eyebrow. That's how I remember it. So, you are going to lie and make sure I don't go to jail. Maybe a little, but you asked me once if I would break the law to save a child. Keigo snorted. So, I am a child. Kid, child, it's all the same. You just said it wasn't. Shota hummed, fighting back a grin. He continued brushing through Keigo's hair until he heard something crack. Looking down he saw what looked like a feather that was encased in some hard cover. It felt a bit like thin brittle plastic. The moment it cracked, Keigo cringed, letting out a gasp. Shota paused, worried he'd hurt the kid somehow. He was going to have to do some research on feathers and birds so he wasn't caught unaware again. Shota started to remove his hand, his mouth open to apologize when Keigo shook his head. No, don't stop. It is just a pin feather. It felt really nice. He paused. You can finish breaking it open if you want. Keigo's voice was tentative but hopeful, bordering on desperate. Shota felt like he was missing something. But he didn't have an issue with it, so he hummed and went to pinch the encased pin feather. The outer casing cracked under the soft pressure and he was able to slide it off, freeing an incredibly fluffy-looking blonde feather. Keigo let out a large sigh. Thanks. His voice was small but the gratitude filled the single word till it cracked. Anytime, kid. Not a kid. Keigo slurred out. Shota let out a laugh, before sobering. He hated to have to circle back to the pain, But they still needed more information and Keigo seemed to be open to sharing right now. Keigo, what else did they do to you, Mr. Watanabe? Yeah, or the commission. Can't talk about the commission. It's not allowed. After a second Keigo added a little softer, it's a secret. Even if Shota had been colorblind, he would have been able to identify that red flag. It was big and blaring and made Shota want to throttle every HPSC agent. Okay. What about just Mr. Watanabe? He got assigned as a handler for the more volatile quirks. Was mine growing up. His quirk is kinda like yours. But it only stops quirks when reacting to him. So he likes to taunt those with more aggressive quirks, calling himself invincible. He liked to push buttons and laugh when they tried to attack him only for it not to work. He also was a sadist. Liked to beat all us trainees to a pulp at any chance he got. Trainees? There are more kids? Shota felt a zing of anxiety knowing that he might have to go through what he did with Izuku with an untold number of other kids. It sounded exhausting, but he'd do it. Not anymore. Keigo paused, looking back at Izuku. Or so I thought. I was the only one who finished to become an actual hero. Said they closed the program as it didn't really work. Most of the time as a teen I was training with other adult recruits. How young were you? Mom sold me at I think 6. Maybe 7. I kinda lost track when we were homeless. That was a veritable minefield. Shota felt like if he stepped wrong, the calm that he'd somehow managed to build would be blown to smithereens. He wanted to ask, but knew that now was likely not the time for digging there. The HPSC was the goal. He was grateful for the distraction in the form of hair, and just focused on massaging the scalp under his fingertips. After just slightly too long, Shota spoke. Thank you for telling me. Sounds scary. Keigo shrugged. Shota frowned. This kid was way too nonchalant about all of this, it was enerving. What types of training did you have? Dunno, pretty normal hero training. Let me be the judge of that. Alright, it really wasn't that bad. We did hand-to-hand, battle and tactical training, weapon training, PR classes, first aid, sleep and food deprivation training. Deprivation training. Shota was going to be sick. It took everything in Shota to keep his hands from shaking in Keigo's hair. Yeah, you know, test how long you can go without food, water, and sleep. They didn't do food and water often as it would stop me from being able to do other training for a while after. But they liked sleep deprivation training. Said it would be helpful for the long hours heroics requires. What was it exactly? Nothing too fancy. Just loud music and bright lights. They never restricted people from visiting and gave me cases to solve or other puzzles to help me stay awake so it wasn't like solitary confinement or anything. Keigo. Shota struggled to swallow. The warm fingers tangled in Keigo's hair was the only warmth left in his body. It was like the kid's words had ed all the heat from the room. How old were you? Probably started about Izuku's age. Why? No reason. There sure as H was a reason. Namely, what the F? It wasn't too bad, they'd let me out early if I finished the puzzles, so I just got really good at puzzles. Keigo grinned up at Shota. His eyes looked hazed over, distant. Shota mentally cursed, thinking back to the raid and how Keigo mumbled and let some of his thoughts slip without obviously realizing. And the kid looked exactly like that right now. Who knows how much of this Keigo would have spilled if he wasn't half dissociated. Shota felt dirty. He'd taken advantage of the kid's walls being down because of a trauma response. He'd pushed and now needed to live with the consequences. They had more information, not near enough, but Shota was done. He wasn't going to push anymore. Not until the kid was actually ready and willing. Shota felt like a monster as he ran his fingers through Keigo's hair. Bile burned the back of his throat as Keigo let out another happy high-pitched screech. The noise had been cute but now felt like nails on a chalkboard to Shota, a reminder how he'd messed up. Keigo, you eat yet? The kid was practically a puddle against Shota's chest, his eyelids at half-mast, looking more relaxed than Shota had ever seen him. Keigo slowly rolled his head against Shota's collarbone in a slow lazy shake. Nah, not yet. All right. Shota pushed the kid up slightly. It was mostly unsuccessful and only left Keigo stuck even closer to his side. How about I go grab you something? Any requests? Chicken. Shota snorted a little at how quick the response had been. He hadn't been able to finish the question before Keigo responded. Kid obviously had a favorite. Alright, kiddo. Chicken it is. Keigo didn't move from his heavy lean into Shota. Shota shook his shoulder, knocking Keigo's head off its perch. He caught himself before he totally fell over, and grunted as he forcefully put his head right back onto Shota's clavule. You gotta get up if you want food, kid. Keigo groaned, before grinding the back of his head painfully into Shota's collarbone. Shota grimaced. He was getting nowhere, fast. Keigo, a voice from across the room piped up. It was Recovery Girl. Her voice made the kid open his eyes and perk up. You look really tired. The bed next to Izuku is open. Taking a short rest while Shota goes and gets you food would be for the best. Her voice was soothing and upbeat, a small smile was on her face, but the distressed pinch between her eyes shattered the illusion. Of course she'd overheard, her office door was open and he'd never even noticed. Shota mentally cursed again. Not only had he manipulated the kid into spilling about his life to himself and Nezu, but Recovery Girl was also now aware. Recovery Girl shot Shota a tight smile as Keigo clumsily stood and shuffled to then faceplant into the bed. Shota had to shoot out a hand to keep Keigo's stool from clattering to the ground as one of his red wings grazed it as it dragged along the floor. Shota huffed a laugh and rolled his eyes. If nothing else, that dramatic show solidified Keigo's classification as a teenager. He might be an adult on paper, but 19 was still a teen. Shota stood and stretched out his back. Groaning, his spine sounded like someone tap dancing on bubble wrap. It felt really nice. Additionally, the way Recovery Girl's face shifted from horror to unimpressed was worth the future lecture as Shota walked backwards out of the infirmary with a bland smile and 2 thumbs up. I pray for your bones, she sighed out as the door started to swing closed. Through the door Shota raised his voice with a slight laugh, you and me both. After turning down the first hall Shota let himself collapse against a wall and scrubbed at his face. He wanted to feel less gross, but it didn't really work. Just for a day, he'd like things to be less complicated. He wished, not for the first time, that there was some cosmic complaints department. He had some words for the managers. He would even go in person and wait in long lines to have those words because he was more than frustrated over how everything has gone down lately. I apologize. Nezu's voice broke into Shota's mental screaming into the void. I shouldn't have pushed this. Yeah, you think? Shota pushed off from the wall with a kick and stormed off to the cafeteria. He had known it would be bad, but not this way. He thought Keigo would get belligerent, angry, violent, not this. He wanted Keigo to trust him, to feel comfortable enough to talk to him, but this felt wrong, twisted. He tightened his fists till they started shaking. Shota messed up and might have broken the kid's trust, but he wasn't going to mess up again. He was going to get his kid the best GDD chicken ever, even if he had to threaten lunch rush to get it. In the end, Shota did not have to threaten lunch rush. The hero had been delighted by the request and only a short time later came back with a steaming plate of delicious-smelling chicken katsu with a side of the fluffiest-looking rice and some steamed vegetables. Lunch rush had also slipped a bag of cookies into Shota's pocket like he was doing some drug deal, with a finger to where his lips would be under the mask and a thumbs up. Shota rolled his eyes, but he felt lighter. All of the UA faculty had caught onto the tension in the others, and with confidentiality and the dangers of heroism, this sort of tension was common. And those who were outside would watch on while quietly trying to do small things to help lighten the load. Shota couldn't deny that it made being a hero just a little easier. He didn't know how he did it as a solo under before joining UA. Well, he knew how. But he wouldn't advise it as it would give Recovery Girl an aneurysm. If his self-care was bad now, it was nothing like the few years he was solo. This was better. On the walk back to the infirmary, Nezu popped back out of Shota's capture weapon, his phone in hand, and a frown on his face. That couldn't be good. It looks like the commission has made their move. The phone was moved towards Shota's face. It was slightly too close and he had to cross his eyes a bit to see the screen. On it was a quietly playing newsreel. A photo of Hawks was in the corner and a news anchor woman looked serious as she spoke. Nezu used a paw to turn up the volume. Safety Commission has put out an APB on the hero-turned-villain Hawks. He is Quirk trained and highly dangerous. 3 days ago, pro-hero Hawks had some sort of psychotic break, flying erratically all over the island of Kyushu. He was taken in by the HPSC agents. In custody after trying to test for a rogue quirk, the hero snapped and attacked over 20 agents, many of which are in critical condition and one which is confirmed dead. The public is warned to not approach as he is erratic and volatile, but to call this number immediately if spotted. A number flashed across the screen. Once back in custody, it will be determined what was the cause and measures will be put in place to change hero procedure to keep this from happening in the future. Now, we will hear from Pro Hero Heron, the last person he contacted before entering HPSC custody. The screen scrolled from the news anchor to a distressed-looking hero with a feathered face with black marks like hawks along her eyes but about 3 times as long. Her shoulders had fake light gray feathers in a motif of wings. Under her face was the tag of Pro Hero Heron, sidekick at the winged agency. "What do you remember from your last interaction?" asked a voice off screen. He seemed on edge leading up, more so than usual, and told me he had a panic attack over text, so I called him. He talked me out of pulling him for longer than a day. I believed him when he said he just needed a short break. I should have seen this coming. He is so young and has burned so brightly, too brightly. Why do you say that? He's only been a pro hero for just a little over a year, and he just became the lead of an agency and is well on his way to the top 10 before he hits 20, which is unheard of. I've been a pro hero for longer than Hawks has been alive, and still have moments I feel overwhelmed and underprepared. All heroes do. Younger people can of course do amazing things, but this might have just been too much, too fast, especially for someone so young. She turned to look directly into the camera. Hawks, if you were out there and listening, I'm sorry I wasn't able to help you more, and to the heroes put on his case. She sniffed, tears starting to run down the various feathers on her cheeks. Be gentle. I don't think this was malicious. Hawks doesn't have a vicious bone in his body. He is sweet and kind. He doesn't show that side much, but to those closer to him, it is clear how much he cares, so please, take care of him. After that, the news anchor wrapped up the story and moved to the next story. Nedzu clicked his phone off with a sigh. I will collect Hizashi. It looks like we are going with a variation of Plan 447. He unwound Shota's capture weapon just enough to slide down it like a rope. Make sure Keigo-kun is well fed and well hidden. We will see you shortly. Shota blankly watched as his boss skittered down the hall. He looked down at the warm plate of food in his hands and sighed. It seemed that there was no break for these kids. He turned with a sigh and went to deliver the food. Entering the infirmary, there was an immediate shushing noise. Shota sent Recovery Girl a flat look as she excitedly waved him over. I apologize, she whispered, guiding him around the curtains. I didn't want Yamada to wake them, he is always so loud. I am aware. But in good news, Izuku woke up right after you left, albeit briefly. They are now both sleeping. Keigo just needed to see Izuku awake and he was out like a light. Shota passed around the curtains and melted at the sight of the two. Keigo was wrapped around the boy, loosely holding him against his chest, a red wing thrown over the two of them like a protective blanket. Izuku's mouth was wide open, and little snuffles ruffled Keigo's shirt. A small hand clenched the fabric right over Keigo's heart. The younger boy made a small whimper and flinched only for the sleeping Keigo to nuzzle his nose into the green mop of hair. Izuku relaxed. A soft mewing came from him, followed by a soft bird sound from Keigo. They both looked so peaceful. Shota moved one of the stools from earlier over closer to the bed and sat watching the two sleeping boys. Recovery Girl took the plate of food and moved to her office. A soft knowing smile on her face as she returns. I put it away, but I'll make sure that he gets to eat once he wakes. He needs the rest. He really will need it. The commission finally made their move. Is it bad? Not the worst, but not great. She nodded, patting his thigh. You are a good hero, and they have a good team around them to support them. We'll figure it out. Shota just nodded. He should go back to the meeting with Nedzu, figure out what they were going to do. But the warm, sleepy atmosphere was like a black hole that had edged Shota in. Shota smiled. It was more like a cool pool on a hot day that he'd gladly jumped into. It was the first moment of peace he'd felt since that first feather poked him on patrol half a week ago. Nedzu and Hizashi could wait a few minutes before Shota joined them. Izuku woke up feeling a little confused and floating. Something in the back of his mind whispered that something was missing. Something important. But his mind felt stuffed full of yummy cotton candy, and it was sticky and held all his thoughts from getting anywhere. Which was fine, cotton candy was great and it wasn't a horrible feeling, just odd. What Izuku did know was that his arms itched. Now that he was thinking about it, it was unbearable how itchy they were. Moving his arms felt like swimming through concrete, but the satisfaction Izuku got from scraping his nails against the deep prickling itch was worth the struggle. There was a strange squawk from nearby. Izuku ignored it. He was focused on digging his fingers deeper into his arms. It felt heavenly. Maybe if he pressed hard enough he could pick out all the tiny needles that must have embedded in his skin. Izuku? You awake? The voice was vaguely familiar. Izuku felt like he should know it, especially with the anticipation dripping from every syllable. Izuku hummed in response. Was he awake? He didn't really feel awake, but he did know he was itchy. Come on Izu. Just open your eyes. I'm itchy. Maybe the voice could make it better. Your eyes are itchy? The voice sounded confused. Maybe they couldn't make it better. No ARMMMs. Izuku dragged out the word as he dragged his fingers against his skin. He pressed as hard as he could and it felt amazing. There was another squawk as a hand grabbed his arms and separated them. Maybe there was a bird in the room? Hey, hey. Gentle. Izuku squirmed trying to paw his floppy hands closer to his arms. The arms were doing a good job keeping Izuku from itching. It wasn't fair. He let out a long high-pitched whine. Recovery girl? A little help. Izuku heard some words that sounded jumbled and far away and then some quick steps. More hands moved to rest on his shoulders. Hey Sonny, can you open your eyes for us? Oh, that's why it was so dark. He just assumed the lights were still turned off. They did that sometimes. Izuku opened his eyes only to immediately slam them back closed with a full-body flinch. It was bright. He wanted to try again, but this time he went slower and squinted through his green eyelashes. The first thing that Izuku noticed was an old lady standing over him, her gray hair tied back in a huge bun. Her face looked pinched like she'd eaten a sour candy, and she looked as tired as Mom did after a weekend full of double shifts at the hospital. But there was a sparkle of relief in her eyes, like something good had just happened to her. Izuku frowned as he looked at her face. She was really familiar, and Izuku knew that he should recognize her. He slowly dragged his eyes down over her clothes, to see a lab coat thrown over a hero suit. Recovery girl? Izuku sat up abruptly, his cheeks stretched over a wide grin. Recovery girl, the youthful heroine? You are in my top 5 favorite heroes. I gotta get your autograph. Her pinched expression shifted into a wide smile. I'm honored, Izuku. And I can get you one later, how does that sound? Izuku nodded so fast he made himself dizzy. Recovery girl chuckled. So how are you feeling? Any pain? Itchy? He tried to itch at the skin at his arms again only to once again have his plans be foiled. Ah, with stings like you got I'm not surprised. Can I put some ointment on to make it itch less? Yes, please. Izuku held his arms out to her. She snapped on some gloves and smiled. Might be a little cold. And with that she started to rub small circles against his skin. It was the best feeling Izuku had ever had. The itching was replaced by cool relief. He loudly sighed as he stopped fidgeting. I'm glad it feels good, Izuku. Can I check a few other things? And we can get you some water, which might help your scratchy throat. Izuku nodded. Now that she mentioned it, his throat was a little scratchy. In what felt like a millisecond there was a bottle of water pressed against his lips. The cool water felt amazing on his dry mouth. Izuku let out a happy hum, delighted at how it didn't feel bad to do so, so he did it again. Should he be so out of it like this? That would be the pain medication. Soft hands felt around Izuku as he kept humming little tuneless melodies. I didn't want the poor boy waking up in pain. Hey Izuku. He looked back up at Recovery Girl, with a lazy grin. Are you in any pain? Nope. Floaty. The other voice snorted as Izuku started shaking his head. He felt himself start to lilt to the side, so he tried to catch himself. But his arms felt like they weighed a bazillion kilos, so they only half-heartedly flopped towards the edge of the bed. Other hands darted out to catch him. Izuku followed the hands up their arms and got distracted by the super cool UA PE uniform. How lucky! UA was the best hero school. It was where All Might learned to be a hero, and it was where Recovery Girl worked. Izuku hoped to go to UA when he went to high school. There was a snort from the UA uniform. I'm sure we can swing that, Izu. We know a lot of the faculty now. I bet we could get you a good word. Izuku's eyes widened. I didn't know I knew any UA teachers. That's so cool. He reached up to stroke the thick white lines of the uniform. It was so soft. More soft than Izuku had been expecting. But duh, it was soft. UA was the best. While he was distracted poking at the nice rich blue of the sleeve, his other arm was gently guided away, which was fine because he could poke with one hand. And there was someone else's hand rubbing wide circles across his back, which felt amazing. Everything felt amazing. It was different and nice. The rip of Velcro was followed by a tight feeling of pressure wrapping around his upper arm. Izuku froze. The blue no longer felt inviting. The circles on his back felt oppressive. The tight band of a blood pressure cuff pumped along his arm, but it felt like it was wrapped around his throat. It was hard to breathe. His eyes filled with tears and his lip trembled. It wasn't amazing anymore, it wasn't nice. Izuku tightened a fist around the blue fabric, bunching it under his fingers. After a few seconds he was able to hitch a breath through his tight throat enough to speak. I don't think I can do any procedures today, Izuku whispered. The circles on his back and the hands around the blood pressure cuff froze. He felt himself start to shake. Tell whoever it is, I'm sorry. His throat grew a huge stone, making it harder to breathe as tears and snot ran down his face. Izuku shook his head, ignoring how dizzy it made him feel. I'm sorry. I can't. Izuku suffocated as a sob ripped out of him. The dizziness took over and he flopped back. He curled onto his side and drew his arms and legs into his body. He let out another sob at the aching thrum that the movement created. He didn't want to hurt anymore. He was done. It was supposed to be over. In the back of Izuku's mind he knew that there were people talking, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. Someone was breathing really loud near him, their loud hiccuping sobs drowning out the other noises. He clasped his arms over his chest and realized the loud panting was coming from him. Izuku pinched his eyes against the bright lights and tried to squeeze his arms against his chest as hard as he could. Sometimes giving himself a hug made it feel a little better. He let out a small distressed noise. His self-hug was so weak he could barely feel it, even though it made his arms shake with effort. That didn't help at all. Hands tried to grab him. He flinched and let out a whimper. The hands left. Izuku felt so alone. Everyone left. Those hands left. His dad left. His mom left. Ms. Komori left. Even All Might left Izuku alone in the room. The only one who didn't leave was Kei, but Izuku broke the feather. He broke his lifeline to his hero. Izuku hoped that Keigo didn't feel lonely. It wasn't on purpose, he didn't mean to leave. Izuku felt himself hiccup after a harsh sob. He missed him. He missed him so much. A soft, gentle, familiar feeling stroked his cheek. Izuku reached up with shaking arms to grab it. He opened his eyes, feeling them creak open like an unoiled door. In between his fingers was a gorgeous red feather. Izuku traced a shaking pointer finger along the fluffy edge and then along the smooth center part. Keigo had told him it was called the shaft when he'd asked. Izuku studied this feather. It was a little longer and slightly different shade of red, and this one had flecks of almost brown on it. It was pretty. Izuku carefully brought it up to his cheek and started to tap out a message. Kei, you there? Maybe he could tell Kei that he didn't leave him. Tell him that he isn't alone anymore. Yeah, Shikadi, the voice whispered, thick with emotion. The voice itched at the back of Izuku's mind. He knew that voice. I'm right here. Izuku opened his eyes and shifted to look at where the voice had come from and froze. It was Kei. Tears exploded from his eyes. Izuku scrambled, wiggling like a fish out of water to get to Keigo. One of his arms gave out in his mad dash and he face planted into the bed. Pain rushed through his chest and shot out to all of his limbs. Curling slightly, Izuku whimpered. He just wanted to get to his brother. Shy hands landed on Izuku's cheeks. They were feather light as they guided Izuku's head to turn. Half of his face was squished into the hand as it was trapped against the bed under his head. His cheek forced one of his eyes closed, the other wide as he saw his brother. Izuku's vision wavered and shimmered with tears as he looked at Keigo. Keigo looked tired, deep circles carved into the skin under his eyes. The golden eyes were wide and unblinking. The piercing gaze made Izuku feel like they could cut down to his core. He felt totally seen and like he was his brother's only focus. His hair was a chaotic frizzy mess and was a little greasy. He had a few red acne bumps on his chin. But none of that took away from the most important feature. The tiny, tender smile that slowly grew, brightening his face like a sunrise. "You're here." "Yeah," Keigo breathed out, his thumbs arched in smooth curving strokes on Izuku's cheeks, his expression practically reverent. "I came as fast as I could." "That's really fast." "Yeah," he let out a watery chuckle, "I'm the fastest." "K." Izuku whined as he slid a hand over the smooth sheets. He made little grabby hand motions towards his brother, Onisan. Faster than Izuku could comprehend, strong arms were wrapped around him. Keigo really was fast. Izuku's head was pressed against the soft Ua uniform as blue filled his vision. The fingers that tangled in the hair at the nape of his neck also pulled at some snarl that had wrapped itself around Izuku's heart. He was suddenly grateful for the arms as he shattered, the arms the only thing holding him together. As he sobbed and keened and wailed, Izuku felt the knot around his heart unravel. The soft steady pressure around his body burned like an inferno, but Izuku clawed closer, craving the heat. He finally felt warm. Izuku didn't know how cold he'd been until he felt heat again. Izuku's breath was sputtering and uneven, but he had found a soothing rhythm to follow as he was rocked back and forth. The arms shifted to hold him tighter as Izuku thawed, melting further into the hold. He let out a peaceful hum. This felt nice. It was so similar to his mom's hugs, but was distinct. Mom's hugs were full of tender, serene love, and invitation. They were like an evening drinking cocoa by a warm fire. This hug was full of unshakable love and had a declaration of protection wrapped up in it. It was possessive and rattled like a snake's tail, loudly warning others to be careful. It made Izuku feel so safe. It made him feel so loved. Fat tears slowly rolled down his face as they swayed in the tight hug. "You're here." Izuku breathed out, feeling odd. A nose was shoved into the crown of his head, pressing through all of his crazy curls. A shaky breath tickled the top of his head. "Always, Oto. You call and I'll be there, okay?" "K." Izuku let himself completely slump into Keigo's chest. "You give really good hugs." "Thanks. You do too, chickadee." Izuku nuzzled his face into his hero's chest like a cat. He closed his eyes. You're warm." The hold around him shifted a little, making Izuku groan until a blessedly cool hand was pressed into his forehead. "Hey bud, can we check your temperature real fast?" Izuku hummed a yes. He didn't really care as long as he kept being held. A finger tapped Izuku's chin. "Open." A slightly metallic tasting thin stick was put in his mouth. Izuku grimaced. After a short time there was a beep and the gross stick was pulled out of his mouth. Izuku let the words following flow over him. "Is that high?" "Not more than it has been. It's on the high end of a low-grade fever. I already tested for an infection and there was none. It is likely from shock and the built-up toxins. Shouldn't it be better by now?" "Keigo, it's only been 3 days. I might have a healing quirk, but that doesn't make me a miracle worker. These things take time." There was a sigh. A hand reached up and combed through Izuku's hair. He let out a happy hum. A light chuckle rang loudly into Izuku's ear. Such a sleepy little chickadee. Izuku's world tilted and shifted, jostling him. He threw out a panicked arm with a scared gasp. His other hand tightened its grip on the soft fabric of the Ua shirt. Everything froze. "Shish, it's okay, I'm sorry. I was just trying to get us more comfortable." Izuku hummed. Comfortable sounded nice. He was lowered, much slower this time. Keigo was right. Laying down felt amazing. Hands started carding through his hair, entangling the little knots and scratching smooth patterns into his scalp. Izuku shivered and let out another blissed hum. "I like being preened, too." Kei whispered into his ear, like it was some secret. Izuku smiled and lazily blinked his eyes open to look up at his new brother. He wiggled closer and leaned in to whisper a secret back. "Hawks is my all-time favorite hero." Izuku paused to bring a finger up to his lips. "Don't tell All Might." Keigo snorted. pulling an invisible zipper over his lips. My lips are sealed. Good. Izuku tapped a hand heavily against Keigo's cheek. I don't want him to be sad to be bumped down the list. Keigo let out a huff and kissed Izuku's hand, then moved it from his cheek to be pressed against the soft UA uniform on his chest. Izuku's fingers latched onto the fabric. You're a really good kid, you know that? Mom says I'm the best. Izuku's eyelids felt so heavy, and he tried to keep them open but just couldn't. The image of Kei grinning wildly faded to black. She's absolutely right. You're the best. Lips pressed into his forehead. Izuku shivered. You cold? Izuku has been cold for a long time. He hummed a yes. A warm, heavy weight silently settled over him. Izuku melted into a gooey puddle as he was wrapped in the cozy cocoon. The weight shifted and the fluffy feeling of feathers brushed across his arms. Oh, his blanket was made of Keigo's wings. Izuku felt a fuzzy bubbly feeling settle in his chest. He was pretty sure it was love. Sleep, Izu. I'll be here when you wake up. I'm not leaving you, you are okay. K. Izuku bumped his head lightly against Keigo's shoulder. I love you, Nissan. There was another startled bird call, quickly followed by another tender kiss to his hairline. And once again, like it was a secret, Keigo whispered. I love you too, Chickadee. I love you too. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.